Hello, my friend. Tonight we wander beneath ancient desert stars where forgotten stories drift through warm night air like smoke from distant campfires. You hear sandals scraping rough stone paths beside lonely hills. Somewhere beyond the darkness, sheep bleat softly while tired families settle behind mud brick walls. Yet above this quiet earth something restless watches from heaven itself. The old world still breathes calmly for now, but hidden cracks already spread beneath its surface. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you settle in tonight, maybe tell me your location and local time below. There's always something strangely comforting about imagining listeners scattered across the sleeping world together. The night feels immense, endless almost. You begin in an age before famous kingdoms rise from desert sands, before marble temples shine beside crowded harbours, before emperors stamp their faces onto silver coins. Humanity still lives close to rivers, fields, storms and fear. Villages cling to survival with stubborn determination. Children gather reeds beside muddy banks, while elders watch the skies for signs hidden among stars. The world seems simpler then, it is not. Your mind drifts toward the ancient tradition surrounding the mysterious Book of Enoch, a text wrapped in fascination, suspicion, and centuries of argument. Many historians believe its earliest layers emerged during the centuries before the birth of Christ, although parts may preserve much older oral traditions. Researchers at Oxford and Yale have noted that the text reflects deep anxieties about corruption, violence, heavenly justice, and dangerous knowledge passing into human hands. Yet it never settles quietly into simple categories. That is part of its strange power. Even now scholars bicker over how much older mythology shaped its stories, and how much came from uniquely ancient Jewish traditions. No agreement has ever fully silenced the debate. The old storytellers imagine heaven as organized, radiant, carefully balanced. Every star follows its appointed path. Every season arrives with dependable rhythm. Rain falls when commanded. Rivers swell and retreat according to invisible laws. Humanity occupies only a tiny corner within this vast design. Then something changes. For a moment it feels as though the air itself thickens. The silence above the earth becomes heavy with attention. Certain heavenly beings, often called watchers in later traditions, begin gazing downward too long. They observe human beauty, human struggle, human mortality. Curiosity slowly twists into longing, a dangerous longing. You can almost smell dry cedar smoke drifting through an ancient settlement while rumours spread quietly between families. Strange dreams disturb sleeping shepherds. Hunters speak about lights moving strangely over distant hills. Mothers clutch children closer after sunset. Nobody fully understands what approaches, but unease grows like weeds through cracked stone. One curious footnote survives through later retellings. Some traditions describe these heavenly beings not as horned monsters or shrieking demons, but as majestic figures filled with knowledge and terrible brilliance. That detail changes everything. Evil rarely arrives announcing itself honestly. Sometimes it arrives carrying wisdom, beauty, and promises. The people of this early world hunger for knowledge constantly. They want stronger weapons against predators, better ways to shape metal, secrets hidden in stars and weather, remedies for illness, protection against death itself. Human beings remain wonderfully curious creatures. You know this already, of course. Someone once looked at fire and thought, perhaps I should touch that. Human history proceeds exactly that way. In your ears, the echo changes into distant chanting from a settlement preparing evening prayers. Oil lamps flicker softly against rough walls. Clay jars line crowded shelves. A father sharpens tools beside the doorway, while children fight sleep nearby. Ordinary life continues peacefully for most people. Yet ancient storytellers insist that unseen forces already gather beyond mortal sight. The Book of Enoch survives because generations refuse to let these strange stories disappear completely. fragments endured through copied manuscripts, isolated communities, and later, discoveries hidden in desert caves. Historians from Harvard and the University of Chicago have observed that the text deeply influenced ancient religious imagination, especially ideas surrounding judgment, rebellious angels, and cosmic warfare. Some themes later echo through familiar religious traditions, even when Enoch itself remains outside many official canons. That alone keeps scholars endlessly fascinated, and honestly, you can understand why. There is something hypnotic about forbidden books. Tell people a text contains dangerous mysteries and suddenly everybody wants to peek inside immediately. Human beings have maintained this exact personality flaw for thousands of years without improvement. The ancient world surrounding Enoch feels both recognizable and alien. People worry about harvests, childbirth storms, violence, and survival. They also believe heaven constantly interacts with earthly events. Dreams carry warnings. Stars communicate hidden truths. Mountains conceal sacred places where divine beings may appear unexpectedly. Imagine living inside such a world every day. You step mentally across dusty pathways between primitive homes, while dogs bark into darkness beyond firelight. The scent of damp earth rises beside nearby rivers. Above everything hangs an enormous untouched sky, blazing with stars impossible to ignore. Without electric lights, the heavens dominate human experience completely. Ancient people do not merely glance upward occasionally, they live beneath the sky with full awareness of its terrifying beauty. Perhaps that explains why stories about heavenly rebellion gain such emotional force. Records from ancient communities confirm widespread fascination with beings standing between divine and mortal realms. Similar figures appear across neighbouring cultures throughout the ancient Near East. Yet Enoch transforms these ideas into something uniquely haunting. The Watchers are not distant symbols. They become active participants in human collapse, and collapse approaches steadily. You notice subtle changes first. Violence increases between settlements. Pride grows among powerful leaders. Wealth accumulates unevenly. Human desire stretches beyond natural limits. Ancient storytellers describe the earth itself groaning beneath spreading corruption, as though creation senses imbalance long before humanity admits it aloud. A cold wind moves softly now. The Watchers continue observing from above, lingering dangerously close to mortal affairs. Their attention no longer resembles harmless curiosity. It becomes fixation. Desire sharpens into decision. Somewhere beyond visible skies, boundaries begin weakening that were never meant to break. Later generations will argue endlessly about what these stories truly mean. Some interpret them symbolically, seeing reflections of corrupt rulers or forbidden cultural influence. Others insist the narratives describe literal supernatural rebellion. Scholars at Cambridge and Stanford continue debating these possibilities even now, comparing ancient manuscripts line by line, searching for clues hidden within shifting translations. Still, the emotional heart of the story remains remarkably human. Knowledge tempts, power corrupts, pride isolates, and some doors once opened never fully close again. You settle deeper into the darkness of this ancient world while stars wheel silently overhead. The rivers continue flowing, families continue sleeping behind fragile walls, the Watchers continue staring downward from heaven with growing fascination. Soon they will descend. The stars remain bright above the sleeping earth, but now you sense something heavier beneath their beauty. Villages continue rising beside rivers and fertile valleys. Farmers bend over wet soil each morning while smoke curls from cooking fires before dawn. Children race barefoot beside grazing animals. Potters shape clay beside shaded courtyards. Life appears ordinary from a distance, yet underneath ambition slowly threads. Your thoughts drift across generations, living before the great corruption fully unfolds. Ancient storytellers describe humanity multiplying steadily across the land, forming clandestine settlements and fragile networks of trade. People learn survival through patience and repetition. They study weather patterns carefully. They memorize river moods. They bury their dead with increasing ceremony, perhaps already wondering whether unseen realms exist beyond mortal life. The world grows crowded slowly. You hear wooden wheels creaking against rough roads, while travellers carry grain-salt wool and stories between distant communities. Some tales speak of unusual dreams. Others mention strange lights beyond mountain ridges. Most listeners dismiss such accounts politely. Human beings have always enjoyed dramatic storytelling beside evening fires. That never changes. Still unease lingers quietly through these traditions. The ancient authors of Enoch describe a world drifting from harmony long before catastrophe arrives. Violence becomes more common. Powerful men dominate weaker families. Pride hardens inside human hearts. According to several historians from Princeton and Columbia, these early passages likely reflect genuine anxieties surrounding social instability during ancient eras of political upheaval and inequality. The stories may sound cosmic, but they also mirror recognizable human fears. That detail makes them strangely intimate. In your ears, the distant hum of insects rises beside warm riverbanks while shepherds guide flocks toward temporary shelters. Nearby elders discuss omens beneath oil lamps. One scandalous aside appears in later traditions claiming certain rulers began presenting themselves almost like divine figures, demanding obedience beyond ordinary authority, whether literal or symbolic. The warning remains clear enough. Power loves worship. You continue wandering mentally through this early world where every survival skill matters deeply. Water must be carried manually. Bread requires grinding grain by hand for hours. Illness can arrive suddenly and destroy entire households within days. Even peaceful existence demands exhausting labour, and still humanity hungers for more. For a moment it feels as though distant thunder rolls across dry hills beyond sight. The old stories insist that heaven notices the growing imbalance below. Humanity was meant to live within certain boundaries according to these traditions, yet people increasingly chase excess instead of wisdom. Greed expands, violence spreads between tribes, desire outruns restraint. The earth begins changing with them. Ancient listeners likely recognize these themes immediately because every civilization fears moral collapse. Researchers at the University of Chicago have argued that Enoch reflects broader ancient concerns regarding corrupted leadership and uncontrolled knowledge. Similar anxieties appear throughout neighbouring cultures, though Enoch frames the crisis through direct interaction between heaven and earth. That interaction approaches steadily now. You walk beside a settlement preparing for evening rest. The scent of lentil stew drifts through narrow pathways while woven curtains flutter gently from open windows. Somewhere nearby, someone plays a reed flute softly enough to almost disappear beneath the wind. Despite hardships, moments of tenderness survive beautifully in this ancient world. Perhaps that is why the coming corruption feels tragic rather than distant. The Watchers still remain above observing humanity carefully. Ancient tradition describes them as beings assigned to watch over creation responsibly, yet observation changes them gradually. They witness human beauty, human suffering, human passion, human mortality. Unlike eternal beings, humans burn briefly and intensely. That fragile intensity fascinates the Watchers beyond reason, dangerously beyond reason. Your mind drifts toward lonely mountains where storytellers imagine these heavenly beings gathering secretly beneath cold stars. They speak among themselves about descending to earth openly. The idea itself violates sacred order. Heaven and earth possess boundaries for a reason, but temptation rarely announces consequences first. Oddly enough, some surviving interpretations suggest the Watchers initially believe they are helping humanity. They carry knowledge unavailable to mortals. They understand secrets hidden within creation itself. Why should humans remain weak, ignorant, and vulnerable forever? Why should divine wisdom stay locked away? It sounds persuasive at first. Most disastrous ideas do. Scholars from Stanford and Yale continue arguing over whether these passages criticize foreign cultural influences entering ancient Jewish communities during periods of conquest and assimilation. Others maintain the text addresses timeless spiritual concerns instead of specific political events. Arguments split sharply across academic fields, and no final consensus fully settles the matter. Meanwhile, inside the story itself, the tension grows unbearable. You notice increasing references to pride and unnatural ambition. Ancient rulers seek domination rather than stewardship. Violence escalates beyond simple survival conflicts. Wealth becomes concentrated among powerful families while ordinary labourers struggle beneath crushing burdens. The old storytellers describe the earth itself becoming defiled through bloodshed and corruption. Heavy language, heavy ideas, and still the sky remains silent, at least for now. A cool desert wind brushes across your imagination while distant jackals cry. Somewhere beyond scattered campsites, families pull woven blankets tighter against dropping temperatures. Above them stretches an ocean of stars so sharp and bright that heaven almost feels reachable by hand. Perhaps the watchers begin believing exactly that. Records preserved through ancient manuscripts confirm that heavenly ascent and descent imagery appeared widely across ancient religious traditions. Yet Enoch gives these movements emotional urgency. The watchers are not abstract symbols drifting harmlessly through mythology. They become participants in history itself. You feel the atmosphere changing slowly around the narrative. What begins as curiosity edges closer toward rebellion. The watchers no longer merely observe humanity from afar. They envy aspects of mortal existence. Human love especially unsettles them. Mortals suffer age and die, yet they also experience connection with fierce immediacy. Eternal beings begin craving temporary things. That never ends well. The ancient authors portray corruption almost like a spreading stain. Human violence invites further darkness. Forbidden influence accelerates existing weaknesses. Small moral failures multiply into widespread collapse. Nobody wakes one morning planning to destroy civilization entirely. Instead, compromises accumulate gradually across generations until disaster suddenly feels inevitable. You have probably noticed history repeating that pattern occasionally. In your ears, the soundscape softens again into crackling fires and murmured conversations beneath starlight. A mother comforts a restless child. Traders secure animals before sleep. Somewhere an old storyteller recites ancient genealogies from memory, preserving fragile identity through spoken tradition alone. And above them all, unseen eyes continue watching. The Book of Enoch survives partly because it transforms cosmic rebellion into intimate warning. The danger does not arrive from monstrous creatures alone. It grows from unchecked desire, wounded pride and fascination with power divorced from wisdom. Those themes remain painfully recognizable across centuries. Human nature changes slowly. The watchers prepare quietly now. Ancient tradition places their gathering upon a remote mountain where vows will soon bind them together. They fear punishment if only one descends while others remain safely behind. So they swear loyalty collectively, sharing responsibility for the coming rebellion. A terrible decision forms beneath beautiful stars. Soon heaven itself will break its boundaries. The night air grows colder across the mountain slopes while distant settlements sleep peacefully below. You can almost hear soft wind sliding through sparse cedar branches high above the valleys. Far beneath these lonely heights, ordinary families rest beside fading fires, unaware that history approaches a terrible turning point. The watchers gather in secret. Ancient tradition describes them assembling beneath a vast sky crowded with sharp silver stars. They stand at the edge of decision, suspended between obedience and desire. Until now, they have only observed humanity from afar. They have watched love, grief, ambition, and mortality unfold across generations. Curiosity has slowly hardened into longing, and longing demands action. Your mind drifts upwards toward these silent figures standing upon frozen stone. The old stories describe them as radiant beings, not twisted monsters. That detail matters deeply. Their rebellion begins not from ugliness, but from misplaced fascination and pride. They convince themselves that crossing sacred boundaries will somehow improve the world below. Human beings make similar mistakes constantly. For a moment, it feels as though the mountain itself holds its breath. The Watchers fear judgment if one acts alone. According to the tradition, they bind themselves together through a collective oath. If punishment comes, they will face it side by side rather than abandoning one another afterward. A disastrous show. Disastrous show of loyalty. The Book of Enoch portrays this oath as the true beginning of catastrophe. Before this moment, corruption spreads gradually among humanity. Afterward, heaven itself becomes entangled directly with earthly disorder. Researchers from Harvard and Cambridge have observed that these scenes reflect ancient anxieties about broken hierarchy and violated cosmic structure. The universe was imagined as carefully ordered, with every being occupying its proper role. The Watchers reject that order willingly. You hear the scrape of sandals against rough stone while cold wind circles the mountain ridges. Below, rivers continue glimmering faintly beneath moonlight. Shepherd dogs bark occasionally across distant valleys. The world still appears calm. Yet unseen decisions already reshape its future. One curious footnote preserved in later traditions claims the mountain trembled beneath the weight of the oath itself. Ancient storytellers loved physical signs accompanying spiritual rebellion. Nature reacts when sacred boundaries fracture. Whether symbolic or literal, the image lingers powerfully in the imagination. The earth notices everything. You descend mentally with the Watchers now as they leave their appointed places above. Ancient listeners likely experienced these scenes with both fascination and dread. Heavenly beings crossing openly into human realms represented a terrifying collapse of separation between mortal and divine worlds. And once separation collapses, confusion follows quickly. The old stories describe the Watchers entering human society not as invaders carrying flaming swords, but as powerful strangers bearing knowledge and charisma. Imagine isolated communities suddenly encountering beings who understand hidden arts, celestial movements, and mysteries beyond ordinary comprehension. The effect would feel overwhelming. People listen immediately. Of course they do. Your thoughts move through narrow village paths where whispers spread faster than smoke. Strange newcomers appear possessing impossible wisdom. They speak confidently about stars, metals, healing, and secrets hidden within creation itself. Their presence unsettles some people while captivating others completely. That combination usually signals trouble. In your ears, the sound changes into crowded evening gatherings, where villagers lean close beside firelight listening to stories from the newcomers. Sparks rise into darkness while shadows flicker across curious faces. Some listeners feel inspired. Others feel deeply uneasy without understanding why. Ancient tradition insists the Watchers become especially captivated by human women. The text presents this attraction not as simple romance, but as another shattered boundary carrying enormous consequences. Scholars from Yale and Stanford continue debating whether these passages symbolize political alliances, foreign cultural influence, or literal supernatural union. Arguments remain intense because the imagery resists easy explanation. Still, the emotional logic stays clear enough. The Watchers no longer wish merely to observe humanity. They want participation, possession, experience. A dangerous hunger the wolf awakens. You walk beside moonlit fields while distant drums echo faintly from celebrations somewhere beyond the hills. Human life feels vivid and immediate compared with eternal existence above. Mortals laugh loudly, grieve openly, love fiercely, and disappear quickly. The Watchers become intoxicated by this intensity. That intoxication blinds them. Records from ancient cultures across the Near East confirm widespread stories involving divine beings interacting with humanity, though. Enoch frames such encounters as catastrophic violations rather than heroic myths. Historians from Princeton have noted that the text sharply criticizes the idea of heavenly powers producing earthly dynasties through direct involvement with humans, because the results become horrifying. But not immediately. At first, the Watchers appear almost beneficial to certain communities. They introduce advanced skills and hidden arts. People gain new methods for shaping tools, studying the heavens, and understanding natural forces. Civilization accelerates rapidly beneath their influence. You can imagine the excitement to spread all your... Suddenly, stronger weapons become possible. New forms of ornamentation emerge. Knowledge once inaccessible now circulates among ambitious rulers and craftsmen. Human beings have always greeted innovation with equal parts wonder and recklessness. Nobody pauses long enough to ask whether every discovery should exist. The ancient storytellers emphasize this moral tension constantly. Knowledge itself is not always evil. The danger lies in wisdom separated from restraint and humility. According to traditions preserved through Enoch, humanity receives powerful abilities before developing moral maturity sufficient to handle them responsibly. An old problem, a permanent one. Your mind drifts towards settlements growing larger and wealthier under new influences. Metal flashes brighter beside market stalls. Decorative cosmetics appear among elite families. Warfare becomes increasingly organized and devastating. Competition intensifies between clans and emerging rulers. The Watchers promised elevation. Instead, they amplify corruption already present within human hearts. No agreement has been reached among scholars regarding whether Enoch intended these teachings literally or symbolically. Researchers from Oxford and the University of Chicago often emphasize the text's role as moral warning, rather than historical reporting, yet even symbolic readings preserve remarkable emotional force, because the core fear remains timeless. What happens when power arrives faster than wisdom? You hear distant hammering now as metalworkers labour beside glowing furnaces through the night. Sparks leap upward like tiny stars escaping earthbound gravity. Nearby, young warriors admire newly forged weapons while elders exchange worried glances. Progress transforms society quickly, but not peacefully. The old balance disappears, and the Watchers continue descending deeper into mortal affairs with every passing generation. They no longer stand apart from humanity. They shape it actively, feeding ambition while indulging their own forbidden desires. Above them, heaven waits silently. Judgment has not yet arrived, but tension thickens across the story like gathering storm clouds beyond distant mountains. Ancient listeners would already understand the pattern unfolding. Boundaries broken in secret rarely remain hidden forever. Consequences travel slowly sometimes, then all at once. The valleys no longer feel peaceful beneath the stars. Something heavier presses against the world now like distant thunder refusing to break. Fires burn later into the night across expanding settlements. Weapons gleam beside crowded markets. Songs still rise from village gatherings, yet fear lingers beneath the music like a low hidden note. The giants begin appearing. Ancient tradition describes them as enormous offspring born from the union between Watchers and human women. The stories surround these beings with both fascination and terror. They are not merely tall warriors or unusually strong rulers. The text presents them as overwhelming forces whose appetites distort the balance of the world itself. You feel their presence before you see them. In your imagination, footsteps shake packed earth outside fragile settlements. Livestock panic behind wooden fences. Children fall silent whenever these towering figures approach. The old storytellers describe societies bending beneath growing violence as the giants spread across the land, and hunger follows closely behind them. Your thoughts move through crowded grain stores stripped bare after impossible demands. Farmers labour endlessly, yet harvests vanish quickly into the hands of the powerful. Ancient listeners would recognise the symbolism immediately. Unchecked strength consumes everything around it. Some things never change. Researchers from Columbia and Princeton have observed that giant traditions across ancient literature often reflected fears surrounding abusive rulers, military domination, and collapsing social order. In Enoch, the giants become living manifestations of corrupted power itself. They embody excess without restraint. The earth groans beneath them. For a moment, it feels as though dry wind sweeps across abandoned fields where crops once grew peacefully. Villagers whisper nervous warnings, while travellers avoid certain roads entirely after sunset. Stories spread faster than caravans now. Entire settlements vanish. Violence becomes ordinary. One scandalous aside preserved through later traditions claims the giants eventually turned against one another in endless conflict, devouring resources and destroying communities simply to satisfy pride and appetite. Ancient authors rarely portray corruption as stable for long. Violence inevitably consumes itself eventually, but countless innocent people suffer. You walk mentally beside exhausted families fleeing unstable regions beneath cold moonlight. Parents carry sleeping children wrapped in rough blankets while elders stumble behind overloaded animals. The old world feels increasingly unsafe. Ancient harmony collapses beneath rising brutality. The Watchers still remain involved. That detail matters deeply. According to Enoch, the Watchers do not merely unleash chaos accidentally and disappear. They continue teaching forbidden arts while their giant offspring dominate humanity physically. Corruption spreads simultaneously through knowledge and force. Together they reshape civilization into something darker. In your ears, distant screams dissolve into crackling firelight beside defensive walls hastily reinforced against attack. Men sharpen spears nervously. Women hide food supplies beneath floor stones. Nobody trusts tomorrow anymore. The atmosphere changes completely. Records from historians studying ancient Near Eastern literature confirm that giant traditions appeared across several neighbouring cultures, though Enoch gives them unusual moral significance. Scholars at Yale have argued that these stories reflect anxieties surrounding oppressive elites who consumed wealth while ordinary people suffered famine and instability. The symbolism feels painfully recognisable. Your mind drifts toward giant figures striding across hills at dawn, while ordinary humans scatter below like frightened birds. The stories emphasize scale repeatedly because scale creates helplessness. How does a farmer resist overwhelming power? How does a village survive against beings who treat violence like entertainment? It doesn't. And still humanity keeps searching for advantage through forbidden knowledge. New weapons emerge constantly. Metalworking advances rapidly. Astrology and occult practices spread through influential circles. Ancient storytellers portray civilization accelerating toward destruction, while convincing itself it is becoming more enlightened. A familiar contradiction. Oddly enough, some surviving interpretations suggest the giants themselves become tragic figures in certain traditions. They inherit unnatural existence without guidance or belonging. Neither fully heavenly nor fully human, they exist outside proper order entirely. That isolation twists into rage. Pain often becomes cruelty eventually. You continue across this collapsing landscape where smoke rises from ruined settlements beside silent rivers. Birds circle abandoned fields. The scent of ash hangs heavily over damaged roads once used for trade and celebration. Even nature appears disturbed by spreading corruption. The Book of Enoch repeatedly describes the earth crying out beneath violence. Ancient listeners understood land spiritually as well as physically. Bloodshed polluted creation itself. Historians from Stanford and Oxford note that this imagery reflected deeply rooted beliefs about moral actions affecting cosmic balance directly. Nothing remains isolated. Not suffering, not greed, not violence. You hear hammer blows echoing from fortified cities where rulers accumulate wealth and power despite surrounding misery. The giants become symbols of domination without mercy. Their strength inspires fear instead of protection. Ancient tradition insists they consume resources faster than the earth can replenish them. Excess always devours its future eventually. For a moment it feels as though dark clouds gather above distant mountains while rivers swell ominously below. The world itself seems exhausted. Ancient storytellers build tension carefully towards inevitable judgment, but first they want listeners to feel the full weight of corruption settling over humanity, and that weight becomes unbearable. Arguments continue among modern scholars regarding whether the giants originated from older mythological traditions adapted into Enoch's moral framework. Researchers from the University of Chicago have pointed towards parallels with ancient heroic legends, while emphasizing Enoch's radically negative interpretation. Unlike other cultures celebrating giant heroes, Enoch treats them as a catastrophic failure. That difference matters enormously. These are not glorious conquerors. They are warnings. Your imagination lingers beside frightened households, barricading doors against distant violence, while cold rain taps softly against rooftops. Somewhere nearby, an old storyteller recites earlier generations from memory, preserving fragile hope that the world once held greater peace. People cling to memory during dark times. The Watchers, meanwhile, continue sinking deeper into rebellion. What began as fascination has transformed into open corruption. They reveal secrets never intended for humanity while ignoring the suffering multiplying around them. Pride blinds them completely now. That blindness spreads downward too. The giants dominate kingdoms through terror and appetite. Human rulers imitate their brutality eagerly. Communities fracture beneath fear and competition. Ancient harmony disappears beneath endless striving for power, and somewhere beyond mortal sight heaven watches silently. Judgment still waits, but the world cannot continue like this forever. Even the rivers seem to know it. The nights grow louder across the ancient world now, hammering echoes from metal workshops long after sunset while smoke drifts heavily above crowded settlements. Traders move nervously between cities guarded by armed escorts. Even distant shepherd camps whisper about strange teachings, spreading from valley to valley, like sparks carried through dry grass. The forbidden knowledge multiplies. You walk beside glowing furnaces where craftsmen shape metal with astonishing precision. Sparks burst upward into darkness while young apprentices stare with wide admiration. Ancient tradition claims the Watchers reveal secrets previously hidden from humanity, including advanced metalworking weapon crafting, cosmetics, enchantments, astrology, and mysterious arts connected to the heavens. At first, the discoveries seem miraculous. Most dangerous things do. Your mind drifts through noisy workshops smelling of charcoal sweat and molten ore. Men strike heated blades rhythmically against stone anvils. Wealthy rulers commission stronger armor and sharper weapons, while ambitious warriors dream of conquest. Civilization advances rapidly beneath these new teachings. Peace does not advance alongside it. Researchers from Harvard and Stanford have noted that Enoch treats technological progress with deep moral suspicion whenever wisdom fails to guide its use. The text never condemns knowledge completely. Instead, it warns that certain secrets may arrive before humanity develops ethical restraint strong enough to survive them responsibly. An ancient concern, still painfully relevant. In your ears, the soundscape shifts toward crowded marketplaces filled with perfumes, painted fabrics, polished jewelry, and exotic materials from distant regions. One curious footnote preserved in later traditions specifically criticizes the teaching of cosmetics and ornamentation linking vanity with social corruption. Honestly, humanity probably would have invented expensive beauty trends eventually anyway. Still, the symbolism remains powerful. The old storytellers describe outward appearance becoming another battlefield for pride, temptation, and competition. Elite families display wealth openly while poorer communities struggle merely to survive worsening instability. Forbidden knowledge does not spread evenly. It concentrates around ambitious rulers and influential circles first. That imbalance fuels resentment quickly. You continue along narrow city streets, crowded with merchants shouting beside hanging oil lamps. Astrologers chart star movements for wealthy clients seeking hidden advantage. Diviners promise secret insight into fate and fortune. Ancient listeners likely recognize these practices from their own societies where magical arts and celestial interpretation often carried enormous political influence. People have always wanted certainty about tomorrow, even when certainty becomes manipulation. For a moment, it feels as though warm incense smoke curls through temple corridors, while nervous petitioners wait for predictions from respected seers. The Watchers have taught humanity to search obsessively for hidden power within creation itself. Knowledge, once treated cautiously, now becomes commodity and weapon. The atmosphere grows spiritually crowded. Records from Yale and Oxford confirm that ancient communities throughout the Near East often associated specialized knowledge with divine or semi-divine sources. Enoch transforms that idea into warning literature. According to its vision, humanity gains access to mysteries carrying consequences beyond mortal understanding, and curiosity rarely stops voluntarily. You notice increasing references to warfare throughout these traditions. New metalworking techniques create stronger blades and armor. Organized violence expands alongside technological sophistication. The old balance between neighboring settlements collapses beneath escalating competition. One scandalous aside found in later commentary even suggests the Watchers taught methods specifically designed to increase bloodshed efficiently. Ancient authors clearly feared innovation detached from moral responsibility, a fear history repeatedly validates. Your thoughts move toward fortified cities rising behind thick defensive walls, while ordinary farmers labor under growing taxation to support military ambitions. The giants dominate physically, but forbidden knowledge strengthens human corruption from within. Together they reshape society into something harsher and more unstable. The earth continues groaning beneath it all. In your ears, distant thunder rolls across dry plains while travelers hurry toward shelter before nightfall. Somewhere beyond visible hills, armed conflicts burn through villages previously untouched by violence. Children grow up learning fear before peace. The old world darkens steadily. Scholars from Columbia and the University of Chicago continue debating whether Enoch critiques specific historical developments during periods of expanding empire and cultural exchange. Some argue the forbidden teachings symbolize foreign influence entering ancient Jewish communities. Others interpret the stories more universally as warnings about pride and moral collapse accompanying unchecked advancement. No interpretation removes the emotional force, because the central question remains timeless. What kind of wisdom actually helps humanity flourish? You pause mentally beside a wealthy ruler examining newly forged weapons beneath torchlight. Advisors flatter him constantly, while servants avoid direct eye contact. Outside palace walls, hungry labourers crowd narrow streets hoping for scraps. The forbidden knowledge increases inequality as much as capability. Progress often arrives unevenly, and uneven progress breeds instability. Oddly enough, ancient tradition also associates the Watchers with revealing celestial knowledge, including signs within the stars and movements of heavenly bodies. Astronomy itself was not necessarily condemned. Many ancient societies studied the skies carefully for calendars and navigation. The problem emerges when humans seek domination through hidden knowledge rather than humble understanding. Control becomes the obsession. You feel that obsession spreading now through the narrative like rising floodwater beneath closed doors. Human ambition no longer accepts natural limits. Rulers want immortality through conquest, diviners promise secret advantage. Warriors pursue glory through violence. Wealthy elites indulge endless luxury while ordinary families suffer growing hardship. And above them all, the Watchers continue encouraging corruption they no longer control. The Book of Enoch presents forbidden knowledge almost like fire stolen recklessly from heaven. Useful in some ways, catastrophic in others. Researchers at Princeton have noted similarities between these themes, and broader ancient myths warning about divine boundaries violated through prideful ambition. Human beings rarely learn slowly enough for safety. You hear rain beginning softly against rooftops while exhausted workers return home carrying tools blackened by smoke and heat. Mothers pull children indoors before darkness deepens. Somewhere nearby, an elderly storyteller quietly recalls earlier generations when life felt simpler and more balanced. Memory becomes resistance during collapsing times. The forbidden teachings continue spreading regardless. Astrology enchantments, warfare, luxury, and manipulation reshape civilization layer by layer. Ancient harmony fades beneath restless striving for power and control. The Watchers wanted participation in human life. Instead, they helped magnify humanity's worst instincts. And still judgment delays. That delay matters because ancient listeners understood something uncomfortable about corruption. It rarely destroys societies instantly. Collapse unfolds gradually while people normalize each new layer of dysfunction, until catastrophe suddenly feels unavoidable. Above the troubled earth, the stars remain cold and silent tonight, but heaven has not stopped watching. The earth feels exhausted now beneath the ancient sky. Smoke hangs constantly above crowded settlements while rivers carry mud darkened by endless conflict. Roads once used for trade and celebration now fill with armed patrols, wandering refugees, and frightened travellers moving quietly before nightfall. Corruption settles everywhere. You drift beside weary farming families harvesting grain under anxious watch. Children no longer play far from home without supervision. Mothers lower their voices whenever strangers approach. Even the animals seem restless, reacting to tension humans pretend not to notice openly. The world has changed completely. Ancient tradition describes violence spreading beyond isolated kingdoms into nearly every corner of human life. The giants dominate through appetite and brutality, while ordinary rulers imitate their cruelty eagerly. Forbidden knowledge continues fueling ambition, warfare, and pride. According to the old storytellers, the earth itself begins crying out beneath unbearable corruption. That image lingers powerfully. For a moment it feels as though cracked soil stretches endlessly beneath hot wind, while distant thunder mutters somewhere beyond empty hills. Ancient listeners understood land spiritually as well as physically. Human behavior affected creation directly. Bloodshed polluted rivers. Greed poisoned communities. Violence scarred the world itself. Nothing remained untouched. Researchers from Oxford and Columbia have observed that Enoch reflects broader ancient beliefs linking moral collapse with cosmic disorder. Societies across the ancient Near East often interpreted famine war and environmental instability as signs of spiritual imbalance rather than random misfortune alone. The universe felt deeply interconnected. You walk mentally through overcrowded settlements where exhausted labourers drag water jars across dusty streets lined with armed guards. Wealthy elites feast behind fortified walls while hungry families barter desperately for scraps nearby. Ancient storytellers emphasise inequality repeatedly because corruption rarely spreads evenly. Some people profit from collapse, others simply endure it. In your ears, distant arguments rise from crowded marketplaces where grain prices climb beyond ordinary reach. Merchants hide supplies, rulers impose heavier demands. Fear sharpens every interaction. One curious footnote preserved through later traditions even claims ordinary people began avoiding eye contact constantly, terrified of attracting attention from violent authorities or wandering giants. A small detail, deeply human. You continue beside rivers where fishermen cast nets beneath grey morning skies, while smoke from burned villages stains the horizon. The old world still functions mechanically. Crops grow, trade continues, families marry and raise children. Yet beneath ordinary routines lies constant dread. That combination feels especially troubling. Historians from Harvard and Stanford have noted that ancient apocalyptic literature often emerges during periods when communities experience profound instability and powerlessness. Enoch transforms those anxieties into cosmic narrative. Corruption becomes so severe that heaven itself must eventually respond, but judgment has not arrived yet. That delay torments the story. Your thoughts drift toward isolated households attempting to preserve kindness despite surrounding brutality. A father repairs sandals carefully beside dim firelight. An elderly woman shares precious bread with hungry neighbours. Children still laugh occasionally beside wells during brief moments of safety. Human tenderness survives stubbornly, even in dark times. The Book of Enoch never portrays corruption as total. That detail matters. The world groans beneath violence, yet fragments of decency remain scattered across exhausted communities. Ancient listeners likely found comfort in that idea. Small acts of goodness still matter when larger systems collapse. You probably know that feeling yourself sometimes. In your ears, the echo changes into steady rainfall against rooftops, while frightened families huddle indoors listening to rumours carried by travellers. Entire regions supposedly fall under giant control now. Some roads become impossible to cross safely. Strange rituals spread through desperate populations searching for protection or hidden power. Fear makes people vulnerable. The Watchers continue influencing humanity directly and indirectly. Ancient tradition describes them teaching enchantments, secret signs, and manipulative arts that deepen confusion further. Researchers from Yale have argued that these teachings symbolize social fragmentation, where trusted boundaries between truth and deception gradually dissolved. Once trust collapses, societies weaken quickly. You feel that weakening everywhere now throughout the narrative. Leaders pursue self-interest openly. Violence becomes normalized. Knowledge serves domination rather than wisdom. Communities fracture beneath suspicion and competition. The earth groans louder. Oddly enough, no. Some ancient interpretations suggest nature itself begins reacting physically to corruption during this period. Unusual storms increase. Harvests fail unpredictably. Animals behave strangely. Whether symbolic or literal, the message remains unmistakable. Creation rejects imbalance eventually. Scholars continue debating whether Enoch reflects memory of actual environmental crises filtered through religious imagination. Researchers from the University of Chicago have explored possible connections between ancient climate instability and apocalyptic storytelling traditions. Arguments remain unresolved, but the emotional resonance persists regardless. Because people naturally search for meaning during collective suffering. You move beside overcrowded roads where displaced families carry possessions wrapped in worn cloth bundles. Oxen strain beneath heavy carts. Babies cry softly through cold nights while exhausted parents stare toward uncertain horizons. Civilization itself feels fragile now. Ancient harmony seems almost impossible to remember. One scandalous aside preserved through later commentary claims, some rulers openly celebrated violence as proof of strength during this era. The old storytellers treat such pride as final evidence of moral collapse. When cruelty becomes admired publicly, judgment approaches quickly. History occasionally offers similar reminders. In your imagination, the scent of wet earth rises after sudden rain, while distant bells echo from guarded city gates closing before dark. Fear governs daily life. Trust disappears. The giants continue consuming resources endlessly, while the Watchers ignore consequences they helped unleash. Yet heaven has not forgotten. That quiet truth begins threading through the story now like faint light beneath heavy clouds. Ancient tradition insists that cries from the suffering earth rise upward continually before the divine court. Innocent bloodshed does not vanish unnoticed forever. Justice moves slowly sometimes, but slowly is not the same as never. You settle deeper beside this wounded ancient world while rivers swell beneath darkening skies. Families cling together behind fragile walls. The powerful continue indulging pride and violence. The Watchers remain trapped inside rebellion they can no longer control. And somewhere beyond mortal sight, a lonely figure named Enoch will soon begin receiving visions that change everything. The silence before judgment is ending. The rain fades slowly across the darkened earth while scattered fires glow behind shuttered windows. Fear still hangs over the ancient world, but now another presence enters the story quietly. Not a giant, not a violent ruler, not a watcher descending from heaven in rebellion. A solitary scribe begins listening. You walk beside Enoch beneath pale morning skies while mist clings to distant hills. Ancient tradition presents him differently from nearly everyone surrounding him. While kingdoms chase power and forbidden knowledge spreads through corrupt societies, Enoch turns his attention toward wisdom, reflection, and the hidden order beneath creation itself. He notices the silence differently. Your thoughts drift beside narrow footpaths crossing rocky fields, where shepherds guide thin flocks through fading fog. Enoch moves through the same troubled world as everyone else. He sees violence spreading between settlements. He hears rumours about giants and strange heavenly teachings, yet instead of chasing influence or protection, he withdraws toward contemplation. That choice matters enormously. Researchers from Cambridge and Princeton have observed that Enoch functions as a righteous intermediary figure within ancient apocalyptic tradition. He becomes the witness. Humanity desperately needs someone capable of seeing corruption clearly while remaining spiritually attentive enough to receive revelation. The world grows louder. Enoch grows quieter. In your ears, the soundscape softens into distant bird calls and gentle wind moving through dry grass beside lonely hillsides. Ancient storytellers often place transformative encounters far from crowded cities. Isolation sharpens perception. Silence creates room for impossible things to appear, and impossible things soon arrive. For a moment it feels as though sunlight shifts strangely across the landscape while Enoch pauses beside weathered stone overlooking broad valleys below. The old traditions describe mysterious heavenly messengers approaching him with terrifying brilliance. Not rebellious watchers this time, but loyal servants connected to divine judgment. The atmosphere changes instantly. One curious footnote preserved in later interpretations claims Enoch initially trembled so violently that he could barely stand upright during these encounters. Ancient literature frequently emphasizes physical overwhelm during divine visions. Human beings are not portrayed as naturally comfortable before heavenly realities. Honestly, most people struggle enough during ordinary job interviews. You continue beside Enoch as he receives invitations to witness hidden realms beyond mortal sight. The old stories describe journeys through cosmic landscapes filled with blazing crystal structures, rivers of light, and terrifying emptiness stretching beyond imagination. The imagery feels dreamlike and immense. Scholars from Harvard and Yale have noted that Enoch contains some of the earliest detailed heavenly journey traditions preserved within ancient Jewish literature. These visionary passages later influenced broader religious imagination surrounding heaven angels, judgment, and cosmic structure. Their influence spread astonishingly far. Your mind drifts upward with Enoch now, through layered heavens crowded with movement and mystery. Stars no longer appear merely decorative. They become living participants within ordered creation. Celestial bodies follow assigned paths carefully, while spiritual beings carry responsibilities connected to cosmic balance. Everything possesses structure. That structure contrasts sharply with the corruption overwhelming Earth below. In your ears, the echo changes into rushing wind and distant thunder rolling beneath enormous heavenly spaces impossible to measure properly. Ancient listeners likely experienced these scenes with equal parts awe and fear. Enoch does not ascend for entertainment. He witnesses evidence that the universe remains morally ordered despite earthly collapse. Judgment approaches with terrifying patience. The heavenly messengers begin revealing why the world suffers so deeply. The Watchers violated sacred boundaries intentionally. Their forbidden teachings accelerated human corruption. Their giant offspring spread violence across creation. Enoch receives knowledge not merely about current events, but about the hidden spiritual causes beneath visible history. That burden isolates. You walk beside him mentally, while ordinary villagers continue daily routines unaware of the revelations unfolding nearby. Children fetch water beside wells, traders argue over grain prices, farmers repair damaged fences after storms. Meanwhile, Enoch carries visions large enough to shatter ordinary understanding completely. Loneliness follows revelation often. Researchers from Stanford and Oxford continue debating how ancient audiences interpreted Enoch's visionary experiences. Some scholars emphasize symbolic and political dimensions within the text. Others focus on mystical tradition shaping its imagery. Arguments continue because the material resists narrow explanation. The visions feel too expansive for simple categories. Ancient tradition describes Enoch witnessing places prepared specifically for judgment. He sees imprisoned stars associated with disobedience. He observes fiery regions connected to punishment awaiting rebellious powers. The universe itself appears morally alive within these revelations. Nothing escapes accountability forever. You notice how differently Enoch responds compared with the Watchers earlier in the story. They sought forbidden knowledge through pride and desire. Enoch receives revelation through humility and obedience. The contrast becomes central to the narrative. Knowledge itself is not the enemy. The heart carrying it matters. In your imagination, cold air sweeps through towering heavenly corridors glowing with strange light while Enoch struggles to absorb impossible sights. The old stories repeatedly emphasize his fear and astonishment. He never behaves like someone entitled to divine secrets. That humility distinguishes him sharply from the corrupt powers below. One scandalous aside appearing in later traditions even suggests Enoch briefly hesitated before accepting his role as messenger, because he understood how dangerous truth becomes within corrupted societies. Ancient listeners would recognize that fear immediately. People rarely welcome uncomfortable warnings enthusiastically. Still, Enoch continues forward. Historians from Columbia and the University of Chicago have pointed toward Enoch's importance as one of history's earliest surviving apocalyptic visionaries. Later traditions repeatedly echo themes first developed within these ancient passages, including cosmic warfare, heavenly judgment, and revealed mysteries hidden from ordinary perception. The literary influence becomes enormous. Yet inside the story itself, Enoch remains simply a solitary human figure walking carefully through revelations larger than himself. That human scale keeps the narrative emotionally grounded despite its cosmic imagery. You hear distant water flowing now beneath towering heavenly structures, while luminous beings move silently across vast spaces surrounding Enoch. The Watchers once descended willingly toward corruption. Enoch ascends reluctantly toward understanding. Opposite journeys, opposite outcomes, and now heaven prepares to use him as witness against the fallen powers themselves. The old world still trembles beneath violence and fear below. Giants continue roaming the earth. Forbidden knowledge continues spreading through restless civilizations. Ordinary families continue praying for safety through long uncertain nights. But above the chaos, judgment has finally begun moving, and Enoch stands directly inside its unfolding mystery. The heavenly spaces surrounding Enoch seem endless, now filled with movement too vast for ordinary language. Light pours across crystal expanses while distant fires burn without smoke or fuel. You sense order everywhere, even within terrifying beauty. Nothing here resembles the corruption spreading across the wounded earth below. Heaven remembers its laws. You remain beside Enoch as the visions deepen. Ancient tradition describes him entering regions where countless luminous beings move with solemn purpose. Their presence feels overwhelming not because they appear monstrous, but because they radiate absolute awareness. Nothing hidden on earth remains hidden here. That realization unsettles everything. In your ears, the sound becomes strangely layered. Rushing waters echo beneath distant thunder, while voices rise like wind moving through enormous chambers. Enoch stands silently among realities no mortal was meant to witness casually, and at the center waits judgment. Researchers from Yale and Cambridge have noted that these heavenly court scenes became deeply influential within later religious imagination. The Book of Enoch portrays the universe as morally structured, governed through divine justice rather than random chaos. Corruption on earth may seem unstoppable temporarily, but heavenly authority remains intact. That distinction matters deeply. For a moment, it feels as though Enoch crosses a threshold into the heart of cosmic governance itself. Ancient storytellers describe fiery thrones, radiant garments, and blazing rivers flowing before the seat of judgment. The imagery deliberately overwhelms the senses. Human language struggles beneath the weight of such scenes. Smallness becomes unavoidable. One curious footnote preserved through later traditions claims Enoch could barely raise his eyes during these visions because the brightness surrounding the throne felt unbearable. Ancient audiences understood divine presence as both beautiful and dangerous simultaneously. Comforting, terrifying, beyond comprehension. You drift mentally beside him while heavenly messengers reveal records of earthly corruption unfolding below. Violence, greed, pride, and forbidden teachings appear not as isolated incidents, but as accumulated rebellion spreading across generations. The Watchers stand accused openly now before the divine court. Their secrecy has ended completely. The Book of Enoch transforms moral failure into legal language during these passages. Charges are presented, evidence appears. Judgment proceeds methodically rather than emotionally. Scholars from Harvard and Princeton have observed that ancient apocalyptic literature often reflected deep longing for justice within societies where earthly systems seemed hopelessly corrupted. People wanted to believe evil eventually faces consequence, especially when history suggests otherwise. In your imagination, immense books or heavenly records unfold before blazing figures while Enoch watches silently. Ancient tradition insists that every action leaves trace within creation itself. Nothing vanishes entirely. Bloodshed cries out. Oppression accumulates. Corruption writes its own testimony eventually. The earth has been speaking all along. You hear distant crackling fire mixed with low voices echoing across vast chambers filled with judgment. The atmosphere feels solemn rather than chaotic. This is not revenge fueled by rage. It is restoration confronting imbalance. That difference shapes the entire narrative. The Watchers themselves appear increasingly tragic within these scenes. Once radiant guardians, they now stand exposed through pride and disobedience. They crossed sacred boundaries, believing themselves powerful enough to escape consequence. Instead, they helped unleash destruction they could no longer control. Pride narrows vision constantly. Ancient storytellers emphasize that the Watchers corrupted humanity while corrupting themselves simultaneously. Their rebellion damaged both heaven and earth. Researchers from Stanford and Oxford continue debating whether these passages reflect ancient concerns surrounding failed leadership, cultural assimilation, or cosmic disorder itself. The symbolism remains haunting regardless, because power without humility rarely ends peacefully. For a moment, it feels as though cold wind sweeps through endless heavenly corridors, while Enoch witnesses the emotional weight of judgment settling upon rebellious beings. The old traditions describe some Watchers pleading desperately for mercy after realizing punishment approaches. Too late. That phrase hangs quietly over much of human history. One scandalous aside from later interpretations even suggests the Watchers attempt using Enoch himself as intermediary, asking him to carry petitions for forgiveness before the heavenly throne. Imagine the strange tension of such a moment. The righteous scribe becomes messenger for the very beings responsible for widespread corruption. Ancient literature loves painful irony. You continue beside Enoch as he receives their request reluctantly. The Watchers understand their situation fully now. The forbidden knowledge they shared has poisoned civilizations. Giants spread terror across the earth. Human suffering multiplies daily, and heaven prepares response. Fear finally reaches the rebels. Researchers from Columbia and the University of Chicago have noted how unusual these scenes appear compared with surrounding ancient myths. In many traditions, rebellious divine figures remain glamorous or triumphant. Enoch instead presents them as broken, ashamed, and trapped beneath inevitable judgment. The rebellion loses all romance. In your ears, distant weeping mingles with rushing do while Enoch carries the Watcher's plea upward through terrifying heavenly spaces. Yet the answer he receives brings no comfort. According to the old traditions, the Watchers will not escape consequence simply because they regret the results afterward. Some boundaries cannot be repaired easily once shattered. That warning echoes through the entire story. You pause mentally beside Enoch while blazing stars move silently overhead like living witnesses across the ordered heavens. Below, the earth still suffers beneath violence and fear. Ordinary families continue struggling through corruption, unleashed by powers beyond their understanding. But now judgment moves openly. The heavenly court has rendered its decision. The Watchers will face imprisonment. Their giant offspring will perish through violence and coming catastrophe. The corrupted earth itself will undergo cleansing. Ancient listeners likely experience these revelations with complicated emotions. Fear certainly, relief too. This can feel frightening even when necessary, especially when nobody remains entirely innocent. You notice Enoch himself changing through these visions. He entered heaven as a contemplative observer. He now carries unbearable knowledge about the future awaiting the world below. The burden of witnessing transforms him into something isolated from ordinary human experience. Truth often creates loneliness first. The rivers of heavenly fire continue flowing beside radiant thrones, while judgment echoes across eternal spaces. The Watchers stand condemned. The earth groans beneath approaching reckoning. And somewhere beyond mortal sight, prisons already wait in darkness for fallen powers who once believed themselves untouchable. The brightness of the heavenly court fades behind you now, replaced by darker regions hidden beyond ordinary sight. Enoch continues following the messengers through places where light weakens and silence grows heavier. The ordered beauty of heaven still exists above, yet beneath that radiance lie prisons prepared for rebellion. Ancient prisons, terrible prisons. You move beside Enoch through landscapes the old storytellers describe with unsettling detail. Jagged valleys stretch beneath blackened skies, while strange fires burn deep within cracks opening through the earth itself. Chains of immense weight hang across shadowed spaces, prepared for beings once filled with heavenly brilliance. The atmosphere feels suffocating. For a moment, it seems as though cold iron itself carries memory. Ancient listeners likely imagined these regions not merely as punishment, but as visible proof that cosmic order cannot be violated forever without consequence. Everything eventually answers for itself. Researchers from Princeton and Cambridge have noted that Enoch contains some of the earliest surviving descriptions of rebellious spiritual beings imprisoned before final judgment. These passages later shaped broader traditions surrounding fallen angels, underworld prisons, and cosmic warfare across centuries of religious storytelling. The influence becomes enormous. Enormous later. But here inside the narrative itself, the focus remains intimate and grim. Enoch witnesses the fate awaiting the Watchers directly. No symbolic distance softens the scene. No heroic language rescues the rebels from their downfall. Pride ends in chains. You hear distant echoes rolling through cavernous darkness while unseen waters crash far below hidden cliffs. Ancient tradition describes imprisoned stars and bound heavenly beings confined within these shadowed regions. The imagery blends cosmic and earthly elements together deliberately. Creation itself becomes prison. One curious footnote preserved through later interpretations claims certain Watchers wept continuously within their confinement, mourning both their lost glory and the destruction they unleashed upon humanity. Ancient literature rarely portrays rebellion as glamorous for long. Eventually it collapses into grief and isolation, a painfully human pattern. Your thoughts drift toward enormous gates, forged from unknown materials standing across deep ravines, illuminated only by faint firelight. Enoch observes these places with fear and astonishment. He's not touring some strange museum of horrors. He is witnessing the consequences of spiritual corruption made permanent. That permanentness terrifies him. In your ears, the sound changes into chains scraping stone while cold wind moves through narrow passages hidden beneath the foundations of the world. The old stories emphasize restraint constantly now. The Watchers once crossed every boundary freely. Soon they will possess no freedom at all. The contrast feels deliberate. Scholars from Harvard and Stanford continue debating whether these prison scenes should be interpreted literally, symbolically, or politically. Some researchers connect them to ancient ideas about defeated chaotic powers restrained beneath creation. Others emphasize moral themes regarding abusive authority finally losing control. Either way, the emotional message remains sharp. Unchecked power eventually collapses inward. You continue descending mentally beside Enoch while heavenly messengers explain the coming judgment further. The imprisoned Watchers will remain confined until the appointed time arrives for final reckoning. Their corruption damaged both heaven and earth too deeply for immediate restoration. Consequences ripple outward across generations. The Book of Enoch repeatedly insists that rebellion never remains private. The Watchers sought forbidden relationships and hidden knowledge for personal desire, yet entire civilizations suffered beneath the results. Ancient listeners understood this principle clearly. Powerful beings create large disasters. Human history offers enough examples already. For a moment, it feels as though Enoch pauses beside a vast abyss where darkness stretches endlessly downward beyond visible depth. The old storytellers describe imprisoned forces crying out from beneath creation itself. Whether literal or symbolic, the image carries enormous emotional weight. Corruption becomes its own confinement eventually. You notice how different these imprisoned beings appear compared with their earlier descriptions. Gone is the fascination, charisma, and seductive knowledge that once captivated humanity. Now only ruin remains. Ancient tradition strips rebellion of all glamour before presenting its final outcome. That transformation matters deeply. One scandalous aside appearing in later commentary even claims certain imprisoned Watchers begged Enoch to warn humanity not to repeat their mistakes. Imagine that bitter reversal. The beings who once offered forbidden wisdom now become examples of catastrophic failure. Too much knowledge, too little wisdom. Researchers from Yale and Oxford have pointed toward possible connections between these prison traditions and broader ancient Near Eastern myths involving chaotic powers restrained beneath mountains, oceans, or the underworld. Yet Enoch reshapes those themes morally rather than mythologically. The focus stays personal. Choices matter, consequences follow. In your imagination, cold mist rises from underground rivers while dim fires flicker against black stone walls scarred by age beyond measurement. Enoch walks carefully through regions where rebellion has already reached its inevitable destination. Nothing here feels triumphant, only sorrowful. The heavenly messengers continue explaining that the giants too will perish through violence and judgment. Their spirits, according to later traditions connected with Enoch, may remain restless upon the earth afterward, contributing further chaos and corruption. Ancient listeners likely found such ideas both frightening and strangely explanatory. Invisible evil needed origins within their worldview. The fallen world required a story capable of accounting for suffering, violence, temptation, and spiritual darkness. Enoch provides one. Researchers from Columbia and the University of Chicago have argued that these narratives reflect humanity's deep need to locate moral meaning within widespread suffering. Rather than treating corruption as random, Enoch presents history as spiritually interconnected from beginning to end. Nothing happens in isolation. You hear distant thunder now echoing through hidden chambers, while Enoch finally turns upward again from the prison regions. The visions have changed him profoundly. He has seen heaven's order and rebellion's ruin. He has witnessed judgment prepared against powers once feared across the earth. And still the corrupted world continues above. Families sleep uneasily behind fragile walls. Giants roam violent kingdoms. Forbidden knowledge spreads through ambitious societies. Ordinary people struggle daily beneath forces larger than themselves. Yet unseen beneath creation chains already wait for every power believing itself beyond accountability. That truth settles heavily over the story now like approaching storm clouds. Judgment is no longer theoretical. It has become inevitable. The visions surrounding Enoch shift again, now moving from shadowed prisons toward images of catastrophe still waiting ahead. The ancient world continues breathing beneath troubled skies, unaware that its future already unfolds within heavenly revelation. Rivers still flow calmly through fertile valleys. Merchants still bargain beneath crowded awnings. Children still laugh beside wells during brief peaceful moments. But destruction approaches steadily. You remain beside Enoch while strange symbolic dreams and visions pass before him like storms crossing a dark horizon. Ancient tradition blends warning and mystery together here. Nothing appears simple or fully explained. Fire floodwaters, collapsing mountains, and blazing stars move through the visions with overwhelming force. The earth itself seems restless. For a moment it feels as though thunder rolls continuously beyond distant hills, while heavy clouds gather above exhausted civilizations. The old storytellers describe heavenly messengers revealing coming judgment not merely as punishment, but as cleansing. Corruption has spread too deeply across creation. Violence poisons every generation. Forbidden knowledge continues fueling pride and destruction. The balance cannot hold forever. Researchers from Harvard and Oxford have noted that flood traditions appeared across many ancient cultures, though Enoch places unusual emphasis on moral and cosmic corruption preceding catastrophe. The disaster becomes spiritually charged rather than simply natural. The world is drowning spiritually before waters ever arrive physically. That distinction matters. In your ears, rain begins softly against rooftops while villagers hurry indoors carrying baskets and tools before storms intensify. Ancient listeners likely recognize these ordinary weather details intimately. Sudden floods and violent storms shaped daily life constantly across the ancient Near East. Nature already felt powerful enough to erase civilizations. Enoch transforms that fear into revelation. One curious footnote preserved through later interpretations claims Enoch saw visions of trees uprooted violently and mountains melting like wax beneath divine judgment. Ancient literature often uses natural imagery to express moral collapse, because creation itself reflects humanity's condition within these traditions. The earth mirrors its inhabitants. You continue beside Enoch while symbolic scenes unfold rapidly before him. Rivers overflow their banks. Great structures collapse into darkness. Stars abandon their appointed paths. Fire sweeps through regions already scarred by violence and greed. The imagery feels almost dreamlike, yet emotionally clear. Scholars from Princeton and Stanford continue debating whether these apocalyptic visions primarily addressed ancient political crises, environmental fears, or broader spiritual concerns. Arguments divide across academic fields because the text operates simultaneously on several levels. That layered quality explains its lasting power. Ancient listeners could recognize both immediate anxieties and eternal themes within the same imagery. You drift mentally across crowded settlements, preparing for another uncertain season, while Enoch carries unbearable knowledge about what approaches. Ordinary people continue planning marriages, repairing homes, planting crops and trading goods. Most remain completely unaware that their world stands near collapse. History often works exactly that way. Civilizations rarely notice the edge approaching clearly. In your imagination, the scent of wet earth rises beside swollen rivers, while frightened animals grow restless before unseen storms. The old stories repeatedly describe creation reacting before humanity fully understands danger. Birds change behavior, winds shift strangely. The atmosphere itself feels unsettled. Something immense approaches. Researchers from Yale and Columbia have observed that Enoch's flood imagery emphasizes moral inevitability rather than random destruction. Corruption accumulates consequences over generations until cleansing becomes unavoidable. Ancient audiences likely interpreted this as both warning and explanation for suffering already surrounding them. Violence creates unstable worlds. Eventually those worlds collapse. You hear distant hammering from cities still obsessed with wealth, warfare, and power, despite growing signs of imbalance. The giants continue consuming resources endlessly. Rulers continue oppressing vulnerable communities. Forbidden teachings continue spreading through ambitious societies. Nobody slows down willingly. That refusal deepens the tragedy. One scandalous aside appearing in later traditions even suggests some people openly mocked warnings about coming judgment, dismissing righteous voices as fearful dreamers disconnected from practical reality. Ancient storytellers clearly understood how difficult it becomes to challenge societies intoxicated by pride and immediate gain. People prefer comforting illusions, especially during unstable times. The Book of Enoch presents the flood not merely as destruction but as reset. Corrupted systems must break before healing becomes possible. Researchers from the University of Chicago have pointed toward parallels between these themes and broader ancient renewal traditions where chaos precedes restoration. Still, the human cost remains haunting. You continue walking beside Enoch through visions filled with roaring waters and collapsing kingdoms while distant cries echo beneath dark skies. Entire generations will disappear beneath the coming catastrophe. Ancient harmony cannot return without immense loss first. That reality weighs heavily across the narrative. For a moment, it feels as though Enoch himself struggles beneath the emotional burden of witnessing such devastation. The old stories never portray him celebrating judgment casually. He understands human suffering intimately. Yet he also sees corruption spreading beyond repair. Compassion and justice collide painfully. In your ears, the soundscape softens briefly into quiet rainfall against lonely hillsides while a single lamp burns inside an isolated household. Somewhere below these visions, faithful families still survive quietly within the collapsing world. Small acts of goodness continue flickering against surrounding darkness. That fragile hope matters enormously. Researchers from Cambridge and Harvard have argued that ancient apocalyptic literature often preserved hope specifically by insisting corruption would not reign forever. However dark the present appeared, judgment promised eventual restoration beyond collapse. The storm carried both ending and beginning. You notice the narrative tightening steadily now around one family in particular. While giants dominate kingdoms and rulers chase forbidden power, another household listens carefully to ancient warnings. A man named Noah will soon emerge from the shadows of approaching catastrophe, and unlike most surrounding him, he will believe the impossible before the rain ever falls. The rivers are already swelling, the skies are already changing. The old world drifts toward its final season beneath gathering clouds. The air feels strangely heavy across the ancient world now thick with moisture and quiet tension. Storm clouds gather more frequently above distant hills while rivers creep beyond familiar boundaries. Most people continue living normally despite the unsettling changes. Markets remain crowded. Armies still march. Rulers still boast beside torch-lit feasts. But one family listens differently. You walk beside Noah through fields darkened by approaching weather, while cold wind bends tall grasses beneath grey skies. Ancient tradition presents him as a solitary figure surrounded by disbelief. The world around him has grown addicted to violence, excess, and pride. Yet Noah continues paying attention to warnings others dismiss openly. That isolation becomes its own burden. Researchers from Yale and Princeton have observed that righteous figures within ancient apocalyptic traditions often appear socially separated long before catastrophe arrives. They become outsiders precisely because they refuse to normalize corruption surrounding them. Noah embodies that tension completely. In your ears, the sound of wooden beams creaking softly rises through steady rainfall. The old stories describe Noah preparing carefully for coming disaster while neighbors mock his efforts relentlessly. Ancient listeners likely understood the emotional weight immediately. Building something enormous for a flood that has not yet appeared invites ridicule naturally. Human beings rarely admire caution during prosperous illusions, especially not expensive caution. For a moment it feels as though muddy roads stretch endlessly beneath darkening skies, while labourers shape timber beside half-finished structures. Noah works steadily despite ridicule echoing around him. Children stare curiously from nearby pathways. Travelers shake their heads dismissively before continuing toward crowded cities still obsessed with power and wealth. The contrast grows sharper daily. One curious footnote preserved through later traditions claims Noah sometimes worked through entire nights illuminated only by oil lamps because he feared losing precious time before judgment arrived. Whether historical or symbolic, the detail captures the urgency surrounding him. He believes the storm already exists before others see it. You continue mentally beside this isolated household, where practical survival mixes uneasily with spiritual conviction. Food must still be stored, animals still require care, tools break constantly beneath exhausting labor. Ancient righteousness never appears glamorous in these stories. Mostly it looks lonely and physically demanding. Researchers from Harvard and Stanford have noted that Noah traditions reflect broader ancient concerns about preserving moral continuity during civilizational collapse. The ark itself becomes symbolically powerful because it represents memory survival and ordered life carried through chaos, a fragile world floating against destruction. In your imagination, the scent of fresh-cut cedar mixes with wet soil, while hammer blows echo across empty valleys. Nearby settlements continue indulging ordinary distractions. Music drifts from festivals. Merchants count profits beneath covered markets. Rulers organize military campaigns. Nobody wants to hear about judgment approaching. That never changes much either. The Book of Enoch connects Noah directly with the corruption unleashed through the Watchers and giants. The flood does not arrive randomly. It becomes heaven's response to generations of violence, exploitation, and forbidden knowledge, spreading across creation unchecked. The earth itself requires cleansing. You hear distant laughter now from travelers passing Noah's enormous construction site beneath cloudy afternoon skies. Ancient storytellers often emphasize mockery because ridicule tests conviction painfully. It is one thing to fear disaster privately. It is another to prepare publicly while everyone around you feels confident and comfortable. That pressure isolates people. One scandalous aside appearing in later interpretations even suggests local rulers briefly considered stopping Noah's work entirely because his warnings disturbed public confidence and trade. Ancient societies like modern ones often preferred stability over uncomfortable truth, especially economic stability. Researchers from Oxford and Columbia continue debating whether flood traditions preserve memory of actual regional disasters later expanded through religious imagination. Mesopotamian flood narratives certainly existed long before Enoch's final compilation. Yet Enoch frames the catastrophe morally, rather than merely historically. The flood becomes judgment against corruption itself. You drift beside Noah's family during quiet evening meals while rain taps steadily against unfinished wood outside. Fear undoubtedly visits them sometimes. Ancient texts rarely explore emotions directly, yet the atmosphere implies enormous uncertainty. What if the warnings prove false? What if ridicule becomes justified? Faith feels different when surrounded by mockery. In your ears, thunder rolls slowly across distant mountains while animals grow restless within nearby enclosures. The old storytellers describe creation sensing change before humanity fully understands it. Birds alter migration patterns. Winds shift strangely, rivers swell unpredictably. The world prepares itself unconsciously. Researchers from Cambridge and the University of Chicago have pointed toward ancient associations between moral collapse and environmental instability throughout apocalyptic literature. Human corruption and cosmic imbalance become inseparable themes within these traditions. Nothing exists independently. Not violence, not weather, not consequence. You continue walking beside Noah beneath skies growing darker each passing season. The giants still dominate many regions through fear. Forbidden knowledge still shapes ambitious societies. Wealthy elites continue living comfortably behind fortified walls while ordinary families struggle through increasing instability. Most people assume tomorrow will resemble yesterday closely enough. History repeatedly punishes that assumption. For a moment, it feels as though silence settles briefly across the landscape before another storm arrives. Noah pauses beside unfinished beams, staring toward distant horizons hidden beneath heavy clouds. Ancient listeners likely recognize the emotional exhaustion carried by such vigilance. Waiting becomes its own suffering eventually. One curious detail preserved through later traditions claims Noah received signs confirming the flood's approach through dreams and strange celestial changes. Ancient communities paid close attention to heavenly patterns, interpreting unusual events as warnings woven into creation itself. The skies communicate constantly in these stories. You hear the final hammer bows fading into evening darkness, while lanterns flicker softly beside the completed structure rising against storm-filled horizons. The ark stands enormous and improbable above the ancient earth. Mockery still surrounds it. Disbelief still dominates society. Yet the rain keeps increasing, and somewhere beyond mortal sight the judgment witnessed by Enoch moves steadily closer toward fulfillment. Soon the first drops will fall without stopping. The rain begins quietly enough that many people barely notice at first. A soft tapping against rooftops, small ripples spreading across village wells, mud gathering slowly beside crowded roads already worn by years of conflict and trade. The ancient world continues its routines beneath dark skies, assuming every storm eventually passes. This storm does not pass. You stand mentally beside Noah while cold rain falls steadily across the unfinished silence surrounding the ark. Families hurry through marketplaces, clutching cloaks against worsening weather. Merchants complain about flooded pathways delaying caravans. Farmers stare nervously towards swollen rivers creeping higher each morning. Still, most people do not understand. Human beings often mistake warnings for temporary inconvenience. Researchers from Princeton and Yale have noted that flood narratives across ancient literature frequently emphasize gradual realization. Catastrophe rarely announces itself with immediate clarity. Instead, ordinary life continues briefly beside approaching destruction until escape becomes impossible. That detail makes the story feel disturbingly believable. In your ears, the soundscape deepens into relentless rainfall against wood and stone, while distant thunder rolls continuously across darkened hills. The ark looms above soaked earth like something impossible, massive and silent beneath storm-filled skies. Mockery disappears first, then confidence. For a moment, it feels as though entire valleys hold their breath while rivers burst beyond familiar banks. Livestock panic behind collapsing fences. Roads vanish beneath rising water. Families begin fleeing toward higher ground, carrying children and bundles of possessions through heavy rain. Too late, the old storytellers describe the floodwaters spreading with terrifying force across corrupted lands already weakened by violence and imbalance. Ancient listeners likely imagined both fear and grim recognition during these scenes. The world Enoch condemned is finally collapsing beneath judgment. The earth answers corruption directly now. One curious footnote preserved through later traditions claims the sound of the storm itself became unbearable, louder than battlefields and impossible to escape. Ancient communities understood storms intimately. Floods destroyed harvests, homes, and entire settlements with terrifying speed. Nature always possessed authority beyond human control. You remain beside Noah's family inside the ark while waters rise steadily around them. Outside civilizations vanish beneath endless rain. Cities built through pride and exploitation disappear first beneath churning floodwater. Fortified walls offer no protection now. Wealth means nothing. Giants themselves cannot command the storm. Power collapses quickly before nature. Researchers from Harvard and Stanford have observed that flood traditions often functioned symbolically as equalizers within ancient storytelling. Judgment strips away hierarchy. Kings and laborers alike face the same rising waters. Corruption may create social divisions, but catastrophe erases illusions of permanent control. The storm humbles everything. In your imagination, the scent of wet timber and frightened animals fills crowded spaces inside the ark while thunder shakes the structure through endless nights. Ancient tradition rarely romanticizes survival here. The experience feels exhausting, claustrophobic, and emotionally devastating. Every familiar landscape disappears. You hear waves crashing against hidden debris while darkness surrounds the drifting vessel completely. Somewhere below, the floodwaters lie abandoned homes, drowned roads, ruined temples, and fields once filled with ordinary human life. The loss becomes immeasurable. One scandalous aside appearing in later commentary even suggests some survivors initially believed they could outweight the flood atop mountains, before realizing the waters would continue rising beyond imagination. Ancient authors consistently portray human pride struggling to surrender completely, even during obvious disaster. People cling to denial stubbornly. Researchers from Oxford and Columbia continue debating whether ancient flood traditions preserve distant cultural memories of regional catastrophes magnified through centuries of retelling. Massive flooding certainly shaped ancient Mesopotamian civilizations repeatedly, yet within Enoch's worldview, the flood transcends historical disaster alone. It becomes cosmic cleansing. The Watcher's corruption, the Giant's violence, and humanity's moral collapse have infected creation too deeply. The flood responds not only to physical disorder, but spiritual imbalance spreading across generations. The earth washes itself painfully. In your ears, the storm softens briefly into hollow silence, broken only by creaking wood and distant animal sounds within the ark. Noah's family waits through endless uncertainty, surrounded by water stretching toward every horizon. Imagine the emotional weight of that silence. Oh, how decent. No cities, no roads, no familiar landmarks, only water and memory. Researchers from Cambridge and the University of Chicago have argued that ancient survival narratives often focused less on heroism and more on preservation. Noah does not conquer the flood, he endures it. That distinction changes the emotional tone entirely. Survival becomes humble rather than triumphant. You drift beside the ark through dark nights, illuminated occasionally by lightning flashing across endless flood waters. Ancient storytellers emphasize duration repeatedly because prolonged catastrophe transforms the human spirit differently than sudden disaster. Time itself feels altered. Inside the vessel, daily routines continue despite overwhelming grief. Food must still be prepared carefully. Animals require constant attention. Families must sleep somehow while the old world remains buried beneath violent waters outside. Life persists stubbornly. For a moment it feels as though the storm finally begins weakening after unimaginable weeks of darkness and drifting. The rain softens. The waves calm gradually. Cold sunlight breaks through layered clouds for the first time in ages. Yet peace does not arrive immediately. The world outside has vanished completely. One curious detail preserved through later traditions claims the silence after the storm frightened Noah's family almost as much as the flood itself. Ancient listeners likely understood why. After endless noise and destruction, quiet emptiness can feel deeply unsettling, especially when everything familiar has disappeared. You hear water dripping softly from the ark while distant mountain tops finally emerge through thinning mist. Below them stretches a transformed earth cleansed through terrible loss. The giants are gone. The violent kingdoms have vanished. The corrupted world Enoch warned about exists now only as memory beneath receding waters, and humanity must begin again beneath altered skies. The silence after the flood feels almost unreal. No crowded marketplaces echo across the valleys. No armies march beside dusty roads. No giant footsteps shake the earth beneath terrified settlements. Only wind moves now across wet stone and scattered debris left behind by retreating waters. The world breathes carefully again. You step beside Noah and his family as they emerge slowly from the ark beneath pale morning light. The air smells raw and clean, filled with wet soil, broken branches, and distant sea salt carried inland by storms that reshaped everything. Around them stretches a transformed earth, still carrying scars of judgment. Nothing looks familiar anymore. For a moment it feels as though the survivors hesitate before touching solid ground again. Ancient tradition often compresses emotional realities into simple actions, yet imagine the strange weight of that moment. They carry grief, exhaustion, and uncertainty simultaneously. Survival rarely feels purely joyful. Researchers from Harvard and Cambridge have observed that post-flood traditions across ancient literature frequently emphasize renewal, mixed with lingering trauma. Catastrophe may cleanse corruption, but survivors still inherit memory and loss. The old world does not disappear emotionally overnight. In your ears, distant birds call cautiously across to newly exposed hillsides while streams rush through altered valleys carved by violent waters. Noah's family begins the slow work of rebuilding immediately, because survival always demands practical labor first. Shelter, food, stability. Human civilization restarts through ordinary tasks. You walk mentally beside small fires burning against cold mornings while rough shelters rise from salvaged materials. Ancient storytellers portray humanity as fragile again after the flood. The giants have vanished. Corrupt kingdoms lie buried beneath mud and water. Population itself has become startlingly small. The earth feels enormous now. One curious footnote preserved through later traditions claims survivors initially feared heavy rain permanently after the flood, interpreting every storm cloud as possible return of catastrophe. Honestly, that seems psychologically reasonable. Trauma reshapes ordinary experiences for generations. Researchers from Princeton and Stanford have noted that flood narratives often functioned as cultural reset stories explaining both human vulnerability and resilience. After destruction, civilization begins again carrying lessons purchased through suffering. At least that is the hope. You continue across the quiet, transformed landscape where rivers flow through abandoned ruins barely visible beneath layers of silt and debris. Nature reclaims the world quickly. Grass pushes through shattered stone. Birds nest among broken structures once filled with pride and violence. Creation heals slowly, but memory lingers stubbornly. In your imagination, the scent of damp cedar smoke rises beside evening camps while survivors tell stories beneath unfamiliar constellations reflected across clean night skies. Ancient listeners likely understood the emotional importance of storytelling after catastrophe. Memory preserves identity when everything else disappears, and some memories refuse to fade. The Book of Enoch suggests that traces of the old corruption remain even after the flood. The Watchers themselves stay imprisoned, but humanity still carries tendencies toward pride, violence, and forbidden ambition. Cleansing removes immediate corruption without erasing human weakness entirely. That distinction feels painfully realistic. Researchers from Yale and Oxford continue debating whether Enoch envisioned the flood as complete restoration or temporary restraint against chaos. Some scholars emphasize the text's ongoing pessimism regarding human nature after catastrophe. History offers mixed evidence, honestly. You hear axes striking wood rhythmically, while survivors clear land for planting beneath soft grey skies. Children born after the flood grow up hearing stories about giants, rebellious watchers, and drowned civilizations that sound almost impossible, almost mythical. Yet the adults remember too vividly. One scandalous aside appearing in later commentary even suggests some survivors avoided discussing the old world entirely because the memories carried unbearable shame and grief. Ancient societies often treated catastrophe as both warning and wound simultaneously. People survive physically before healing emotionally. You drift beside rebuilding communities where practical knowledge suddenly matters more than luxury or domination. Farming techniques, water storage, animal care, shelter construction. The flood has stripped civilization back towards essentials again. Humility returns briefly, at least for a while. Researchers from Columbia and the University of Enoch have pointed toward post-flood narratives as reflections of humanity's recurring tendency to rebuild societies after collapse, while struggling not to repeat earlier mistakes. Ancient storytellers clearly recognize cyclical patterns within human history. Corruption disappears temporarily, then ambition slowly returns. In your ears, distant laughter rises from children chasing one another beside newly planted fields. That sound matters enormously within the narrative. Life continues despite devastation. Human tenderness survives catastrophe repeatedly. Perhaps that persistence explains civilization itself. For a moment it feels as though evening settles peacefully across the renewed earth, while stars emerge above quiet settlements no longer dominated by giants or violent rulers. The skies appear clearer somehow, cleaner, yet beneath this calm rests lingering awareness that humanity remains capable of wandering toward darkness again. The Watchers may be gone. Human pride remains. One curious detail preserved through later traditions claims Noah occasionally gazed toward distant mountains silently during storms, remembering the world lost beneath floodwaters. Ancient listeners likely recognize such behavior immediately. Survivors carry invisible landscapes inside themselves forever. Memory becomes another inheritance. Researchers from Cambridge and Harvard have argued that Enoch's flood narrative ultimately focuses less on destruction than responsibility. Humanity receives another chance beneath renewed skies, but the moral questions remain unresolved. How should knowledge be used? What limits deserve respect? Can civilization pursue power without repeating corruption? The story never offers easy answers. You continue beside these early survivors while smoke rises gently from evening fires across slowly growing settlements. Crops begin returning to fertile valleys. Families rebuild homes beside calmer rivers. Trade paths reopen carefully between isolated communities. The world starts breathing normally again. Yet somewhere hidden in deserts, caves and wandering traditions, stories about the Watchers and giants survive quietly. Parents whisper them beside firelight. Scribes preserve fragments carefully. Ancient memory refuses complete burial. Because humanity fears forgetting almost as much as remembering. And across centuries still waiting ahead, those hidden stories will travel farther than anyone standing beneath these renewed skies could possibly imagine. The centuries begin moving quietly now across the recovering earth. Floodwaters retreat fully into memory while new generations rise beneath calmer skies. Villages expand into towns. Trade routes stretch farther across deserts and mountains. Kingdoms slowly emerge again from scattered settlements built by survivors determined to begin anew, and still the old stories travel onward. You walk beside wandering traders carrying woven goods, spices, carved tools and fragments of ancient memory between distant civilizations. The world after the flood does not remain isolated forever. Human curiosity rebuilds roads almost as quickly as it rebuilds walls. Stories become cargo too. In your ears, caravan bells clink softly beside camel footsteps crossing dry desert paths beneath blazing afternoon sunlight. Scribes travel among merchants, priests, and royal officials preserving traditions through fragile manuscripts copied painstakingly by hand. Every written line becomes precious. Researchers from Oxford and Yale have noted that the traditions eventually collected within the Book of Enoch likely passed through generations of oral storytelling before reaching written form. Ancient memory rarely survives neatly. Stories shift slightly across centuries shaped by fear, politics, faith, and imagination. Yet certain themes endure stubbornly. The Watchers, the giants, forbidden knowledge, judgment. For a moment it feels as though you enter dim royal libraries where shelves overflow with clay tablets, scrolls and records gathered from neighbouring cultures. Ancient kingdoms compete not only through warfare but through accumulation of knowledge itself. Priests and scholars preserve myths explaining the origins of suffering, corruption and divine justice. The Enoch traditions drift through this world carefully, sometimes openly, sometimes hidden. One curious footnote preserved through historical commentary suggests certain scribes treated Enochic material cautiously because its descriptions of heavenly rebellion and corrupt earthly power could sound politically dangerous. Ancient rulers generally disliked literature, implying heaven judged unjust authority harshly. That discomfort never disappears completely. You continue mentally through crowded cities where temple incense mingles with market smoke beneath towering stone walls. Kingdoms rise across Mesopotamia, Egypt, and surrounding regions. Great empires collect taxes, build monuments and wage wars while ordinary labourers struggle beneath shifting political tides. Human civilization grows sophisticated again, so do its anxieties. Researchers from Harvard and Princeton have observed that periods of imperial expansion often produced intense spiritual questioning among smaller communities living beneath foreign domination. Stories about heavenly justice and corrupt powers gained emotional resonance during unstable eras. People wanted assurance that arrogance would not reign forever. The Enoch traditions provided exactly that. In your imagination, candlelight flickers across weathered scrolls while careful scribes copy ancient accounts onto fresh parchment. Every mistake matters because manuscripts must survive through human hands alone. A spilled jar of oil, careless moisture, or political purge could erase entire traditions permanently. Fragile preservation shapes history constantly. You hear soft scratching from reed pens moving across prepared surfaces, while scholars debate interpretation quietly behind closed doors. Some readers treat the stories symbolically. Others believe the Watchers and Giants existed literally within forgotten ages before the flood. Arguments begin early. They never truly end. Researchers from Stanford and Columbia continued debating how much older Mesopotamian mythology influenced Enochic traditions. Stories about divine beings, catastrophic floods, and giant figures circulated widely throughout the ancient Near East. Yet Enoch reshapes those themes into moral warning literature focused intensely on corruption and accountability. That moral focus distinguishes it sharply. The text refuses to glorify power. You drift beside travelers carrying sacred writings through harsh landscapes threatened by war bandits and political collapse. Ancient manuscripts survive almost miraculously sometimes. Entire traditions depend upon exhausted individuals protecting fragile scrolls across dangerous roads and unstable kingdoms. Civilization rests upon surprisingly delicate foundations. One scandalous aside appearing in later traditions even claims certain rulers attempted suppressing Enochic writings because the visions encourage resistance against corrupt authority and emphasize divine judgment over earthly empires. Honestly, authoritarian governments rarely enjoy apocalyptic literature. Too many uncomfortable parallels. For a moment, it feels as though desert winds sweep against hidden caves where isolated communities preserve sacred texts far from political centers. Ancient groups often withdrew into remote regions specifically to protect traditions they feared larger societies might corrupt or destroy. Distance becomes survival. Researchers from Cambridge and the University of Chicago have noted that Enochic literature gained particular importance among communities deeply concerned with purity, judgment, and cosmic order during periods of cultural upheaval. The stories offered an explanation for chaos. Empires rise violently, rulers exploit populations, foreign customs spread through conquered territories. Ordinary believers struggle preserving identity beneath overwhelming pressure. Against that background, Enoch's visions about corrupted powers and eventual judgment feel intensely relevant, perhaps even comforting. You continue beside candlelit gatherings, where teachers recite ancient stories aloud because many listeners cannot read manuscripts personally. Oral tradition remains powerful. The rhythms of spoken storytelling help preserve memory across generations long before printing exists. The human voice carries civilizations quietly. In your ears, desert wind mingles with the whispered recitations about watchers descending beneath ancient stars and giants consuming the earth through violence. Children listen wide-eyed beside flickering lamps, while elders nod solemnly at familiar warnings. The old fears still resonate. Researchers from Yale and Oxford have argued that Enoch survived partly because its themes remained permanently adaptable. Every era facing corruption, injustice, or social collapse could recognize itself within the narrative. That flexibility keeps ancient stories alive. One curious detail preserved through historical analysis suggests some early communities treated Enoch almost like hidden wisdom reserved for serious seekers rather than ordinary public teaching. The imagery felt too intense, too mysterious, perhaps even too politically explosive for casual handling. Forbidden books attract attention naturally, especially spiritual ones. You pause mentally beside isolated scribes working late into cold desert nights, preserving stories already ancient within their own lifetimes. Outside kingdoms continue rising and falling beneath indifferent stars. Armies march, borders shift, dynasties collapse. Yet the Book of Enoch keeps traveling quietly through history, carried by memory, protected by fragile hands, waiting for future generations who will rediscover its warnings about power, pride, and the dangerous hunger for forbidden knowledge beneath the endless turning sky. The centuries continue unfolding like slow desert wind across stone ruins. Empires rise proudly beside rivers and coastlines, then fade beneath newer banners carried by younger conquerors. Yet inside dim rooms lit by oil lamps, the old Enoch tradition survive quietly through generations of stubborn scribes. The copyists become guardians now. You sit mentally beside narrow wooden tables where exhausted hands guide reed pens carefully across parchment deep into the night. Outside political storms reshape entire regions. Armies move across borders, kings demand loyalty, priests debate authority within crowded temple courts. Inside these quiet chambers, fragile memory endures. In your ears, the scratch of ink against parchment mixes with soft crackling from nearby lamps fueled by precious oil. Every copied line requires concentration because manuscripts remain painfully difficult to replace. A single damaged scroll could erase centuries of preserved tradition forever. Ancient knowledge survives physically before anything else. Researchers from Cambridge and Harvard have noted that scribal culture shaped nearly every surviving ancient religious text. Preservation depended not upon grand speeches, but upon disciplined individuals willing to spend countless hours copying words accurately under difficult conditions. Civilization owes remarkable debts to tired people with sore wrists. One curious footnote preserved through historical commentary suggests some scribes memorized large portions of sacred writings while copying them, creating living archives capable of restoring damaged texts later, if necessary. Human memory becomes backup storage. Honestly, ancient librarians deserve more appreciation. You continue beside these hidden communities where Enoch's stories circulate carefully among readers fascinated by heavenly mysteries, judgment, and cosmic order. Some regard the text as sacred wisdom. Others approach it cautiously because its imagery and claims feel unsettlingly bold. The book refuses easy containment. For a moment it feels as though cold desert air slips beneath stone doorways while scribes whisper anxiously about shifting political powers outside. The ancient world rarely provides stable conditions for preserving controversial literature. New rulers often suppress traditions threatening official authority, and Enoch frequently sounds threatening. Researchers from Oxford and Yale have observed that apocalyptic literature naturally unsettles centralized power because it insists earthly empires remain temporary beneath higher judgment. Corrupt rulers rarely enjoy texts predicting divine accountability. That tension follows Enoch constantly. You drift through crowded, scholarly gatherings where debates unfold beside shelves overflowing with manuscripts gathered from distant lands. Some teachers argue Enoch preserves genuine ancient revelation deserving respect. Others worry the text encourages dangerous speculation about angels' hidden mysteries and cosmic warfare. No agreement settles the matter. Arguments sharpen across generations. In your imagination, incense smoke curls toward painted ceilings while scholars lean across worn tables, discussing which writings deserve preservation beside recognized sacred traditions. Ancient communities care deeply about authoritative texts because writing shaped identity, worship, and social order. Books carried enormous power. Still do. One scandalous aside appearing in later traditions even claims certain religious leaders discouraged ordinary people from reading Enoch independently because the visions inspired too many questions about heavenly secrets and corrupt authority. People asking difficult questions can become inconvenient quickly. Researchers from Stanford and Princeton continue debating exactly how influential Enochic traditions remained within broader ancient Jewish communities. Some scholars argue the text occupied respected but limited circles. Others believe its theme spread far more widely than surviving evidence reveals. The manuscripts alone cannot answer everything. History leaves gaps constantly. You continue beside isolated copyists preserving damaged scrolls rescued from conflict zones and collapsing libraries. Wars destroy enormous amounts of knowledge throughout history. Fires consume archives. Invasions scatter communities. Political revolutions erase traditions deliberately. Survival becomes almost miraculous. In your ears, distant marching boots echo faintly beyond monastery walls, while nervous scribes hide precious manuscripts inside clay jars and concealed chambers. Ancient preservation often depended upon secrecy during unstable periods. The Book of Enoch survives partly because people protected it quietly. Researchers from Columbia and the University of Chicago have pointed toward periods when apocalyptic writings gained renewed popularity during oppression, occupation, or social instability. Communities facing uncertainty naturally gravitated toward texts promising eventual justice beyond earthly corruption. The emotional appeal remains understandable. You walk mentally beside caravans carrying manuscripts through dangerous mountain passes and hostile territories. Traders transport spices, fabrics, tools, and occasionally forbidden texts wrapped carefully beneath ordinary cargo. Knowledge travels strangely through history, sometimes hidden beside sacks of grain. For a moment, it feels as though candlelight flickers across faded illustrations depicting stars, angels, rivers of fire, and towering heavenly thrones. Ancient readers experienced Enoch not merely intellectually, but emotionally and visually. The imagery was designed to overwhelm imagination itself, and it succeeded remarkably well. One curious detail preserved through manuscript history reveals that portions of Enoch survived more fully in certain distant communities while disappearing almost entirely elsewhere. Geography shapes memory unexpectedly. What one civilization forgets, another may preserve. Researchers from Harvard and Cambridge have noted the extraordinary importance of later discoveries in reconstructing Enoch's textual history. For long periods, many scholars believe significant portions had vanished permanently. History nearly lost the book repeatedly, yet fragments endured stubbornly. You hear desert winds moving softly against hidden caves while isolated communities continue reciting ancient warnings about watchers, giants, and corrupted knowledge beneath endless stars. Children inherit stories older than empires. Scribes preserve words copied from even older hands. The chain stretches backward through centuries, fragile, unbroken. The Book of Enoch survives because generation after generation decides the warnings still matter. Power corrupts, pride blinds, knowledge without wisdom destroys. Heaven sees more than earthly rulers realize. Ancient lessons, permanent lessons, and somewhere ahead in history, buried caves and forgotten manuscripts still wait silently for rediscovery beneath desert stone, where modern scholars will eventually stumble upon voices sleeping for thousands of years. The old stories continue traveling through centuries shaped by conquest, exile, and restless spiritual searching. Cities expand beneath imperial banners while philosophers debate truth inside crowded marketplaces and temple courtyards. Across this changing world, the Book of Enoch survives in scattered communities admired deeply by some and distrusted intensely by others. The arguments grow sharper now. You enter gatherings filled with teachers, scribes, and early believers wrestling with difficult questions beneath flickering lamplight. Which writings carry true authority? Which traditions deserve public reading? Which visions reveal genuine wisdom? And which invite confusion? Ancient communities treat these questions seriously because sacred texts shape entire civilizations. Books decide boundaries. In your ears, low voices murmur across stone rooms crowded with scrolls while incense smoke drifts toward dark ceilings stained by years of burning oil lamps. Some readers quote Enoch with reverence, especially its vivid descriptions of judgment angels and cosmic order. Others hesitate. The book feels too strange, too dangerous, too expansive. Researchers from Yale and Oxford have noted that Enochic traditions influenced many religious ideas circulating during the centuries surrounding the rise of early Christianity. Themes involving fallen angels, final judgment, resurrection, and heavenly visions already existed within these traditions long before later theological debates fully formed. The influence spreads quietly beneath the surface. For a moment, it feels as though you sit beside exhausted scholars comparing manuscripts line by line, while rain taps softly against shuttered windows outside. Certain passages from Enoch sound deeply compelling to communities suffering oppression and instability. Corrupt rulers dominate nations, violence persists, justice appears delayed. Enoch promises that heaven still sees everything. That message carries enormous emotional force. One curious footnote preserved through later commentary suggests some teachers admired Enoch privately, while avoiding public endorsement because the text inspired too much speculation about angels and hidden cosmic mysteries. People become wonderfully dramatic around forbidden spiritual knowledge. That tendency never fades entirely. You continue beside wandering preachers and isolated communities discussing visions of heavenly courts, imprisoned watchers, and coming judgment. Some early believers consider Enoch essential for understanding the deeper spiritual history behind humanity's corruption. Others do. Others disagree fiercely. Arguments split along multiple lines. Researchers from Harvard and Stanford continue debating exactly how widely Enoch circulated among early Jewish and Christian groups. Certain communities clearly valued it highly. Others gradually moved away from it while establishing more formal collections of authoritative writings. Canon formation becomes messy history, not tidy destiny. In your imagination, candlelight glows across worried faces while respected elders debate whether ordinary believers benefit from Enoch's vivid imagery or become distracted by endless speculation. The book raises difficult questions without offering comfortable simplicity. What exactly were the Watchers? How literal were the giants? What knowledge should remain hidden? No easy answers appear. You hear pages rustling softly, while younger students listen carefully beside older teachers carrying decades of memory and tradition. Some communities embrace Enoch passionately because it explains evil in cosmic terms. Others fear the text complicates established teachings unnecessarily. Both reactions feel understandable. One scandalous aside appearing in historical analysis even suggests certain religious authorities worried Enoch encouraged independent interpretation outside controlled institutional teaching. Apocalyptic literature often empowers ordinary readers to question powerful systems. That possibility unsettles leadership quickly. Researchers from Princeton and Cambridge have observed that Enoch occupies an unusual place historically because its ideas remained influential, even where the text itself eventually lost official status. Themes originating within Enoch continued echoing through later theology literature and spiritual imagination. The book leaves fingerprints everywhere, even where people stop mentioning its name directly. You walk mentally through crowded urban centers where competing philosophies, religions, and political pressures collide beneath imperial rule. Early believers seek stability within chaotic times. Questions about justice, corruption, angels, demons, and final judgment feel intensely relevant. The world still appears deeply broken. Enoch continues speaking into that brokenness. In your ears, distant street noise blends with quiet scholarly debate unfolding behind closed doors late into the night. Some readers insist Enoch preserves ancient truths too important to abandon. Others argue the visions risk distracting believers from simpler teachings centered on moral living and faithfulness. The tension never fully resolves. For a moment, it feels as though the entire communities stand at crossroads regarding memory and authority. Which traditions deserve preservation? Which belong to earlier eras now fading away? Ancient people understood that preserving one text often meant neglecting another. Nothing survives automatically. Researchers from Columbia and the University of Chicago have noted that the gradual exclusion of Enoch from many official religious canons did not erase its influence. Instead, the book drifted toward the edges of tradition, where fascination sometimes grows even stronger. Forbidden or disputed texts attract devoted readers naturally, especially spiritual seekers. One curious detail preserved through manuscript history reveals that some isolated communities continued copying and studying Enoch long after larger religious institutions moved toward other collections of sacred writings. The book refuses disappearance stubbornly. You continue beside hidden libraries where aging manuscripts rest wrapped carefully in cloth while dust gathers across forgotten shelves. Outside empires rise and fall with exhausting regularity, yet inside these quiet rooms, ancient visions about watchers and giants remain waiting for future generations. Memory survives quietly sometimes. Researchers from Oxford and Harvard have argued that disputed texts like Enoch reveal how fluid ancient spiritual traditions actually were before later institutions solidified official boundaries. The past contained far more debate, diversity, and uncertainty than many modern people imagine. That complexity makes history feel alive again. You hear the final murmurs of exhausted scholars fading into silence, while lamps burn low beside half-copied manuscripts. Some readers still cherish Enoch deeply, others dismiss it cautiously. Many remain uncertain what to do with it entirely. Yet the stories endure regardless, and far ahead, hidden beneath desert caves untouched for centuries, fragments of these ancient visions wait silently for rediscovery, where modern hands will uncover voices once thought nearly lost to time forever. The desert keeps its secrets patiently. Centuries pass above hidden caves while empires collapse into dust beneath blazing suns and cold night winds. Armies march across forgotten roads, kingdoms vanish, languages shift, yet beneath layers of stone and silence, ancient manuscripts sleep untouched in darkness, waiting. You drift forward now into the modern age where scholars, archaeologists, and wandering explorers begin searching ancient landscapes for fragments of lost history. The world has changed dramatically since Enoch's earliest storytellers whispered beside firelight, yet human curiosity remains beautifully stubborn. People still chase buried mysteries. In your ears, dry wind moves across rocky cliffs overlooking the Dead Sea, while footsteps crunch softly against loose gravel. The desert appears empty at first glance, harsh, silent, unforgiving, but silence hides things well. Researchers from Oxford and Harvard have described the discoveries near the Dead Sea during the 20th century as among the most important archaeological finds connected to ancient religious history. Hidden inside remote caves rested manuscripts preserved for centuries by extraordinary desert conditions, and among them appeared fragments of Enoch. For a moment, it feels as though history itself exhales slowly after sleeping for 2,000 years. Ancient parchment emerges carefully from clay jars and cave chambers, while astonished researchers realize these texts survived far longer than many believed possible. The moment changes scholarship permanently. One curious footnote from early discovery accounts claims some of the first scroll fragments nearly ended up discarded accidentally because their significance was not immediately understood. Human history often balances strangely between preservation and catastrophe. Civilization survives through narrow escape constantly. You walk mentally beside archaeologists brushing dust carefully from brittle fragments covered in ancient writing. Every torn piece matters because each line helps reconstruct traditions scattered across centuries. The Book of Enoch suddenly becomes less legendary and more tangible. Real ink, real parchment, real hands once copied these words. Researchers from Yale and Cambridge have noted that the Dead Sea Scroll discoveries transformed an understanding of ancient Jewish diversity during the centuries before Christianity emerged. Texts once considered obscure or isolated suddenly appeared connected to broader spiritual communities and intellectual traditions. Enoch belonged to a living world after all, not merely forgotten mythology. In your imagination, bright desert sunlight reflects sharply from pale cliffs, while scholars transport fragile manuscripts into controlled environments for preservation and study. Excitement spreads quickly through academic circles. Portions of Enoch long missing from certain traditions now return through ancient fragments sleeping silently beneath desert stone. History reconnects itself piece by piece. You hear quiet conversations unfolding inside research rooms, where linguists, historians, and archaeologists compare damaged texts beneath careful lighting. Tiny differences between manuscripts spark enormous debates. Every missing line matters. Every restored phrase reshapes interpretation slightly. Scholarship becomes detective work, sometimes obsessive detective work. One scandalous aside appearing in modern commentary even suggests certain researchers grew fiercely territorial regarding access to newly discovered materials, leading to bitter academic rivalries lasting years. Apparently, even ancient angel manuscripts cannot eliminate professional drama. Researchers from Princeton and Stanford continue debating what the Dead Sea Scrolls reveal about communities preserving Enochic traditions. Some scholars argue these groups view the text as deeply authoritative. Others suggest more complex relationships between various sacred writings and spiritual practices. The evidence invites interpretation rather than certainty. That uncertainty keeps fascination alive. You continue beside careful conservators repairing damaged fragments under magnification, while outside the modern world rushes forward through wars, technology, and political upheaval. The contrast feels striking. Ancient voices emerge quietly during an age obsessed with speed and innovation, yet people still stop to listen. In your ears, pages turn softly inside climate-controlled archives while researchers trace faded characters copied by scribes thousands of years earlier. The chain of preservation suddenly feels intimate rather than abstract. Someone sat beside an oil lamp writing these words. Someone protected them through dangerous centuries. Someone hid them deliberately within desert caves. For a moment, it feels as though time folds inward briefly. Ancient fears, hopes, and warnings speak directly into modern imagination again. The Watchers return, the Giants return, questions about corruption, power, and forbidden knowledge return. Humanity has not solved them yet. Researchers from Columbia and the University of Chicago have argued that rediscovering Enoch helped modern scholars better understand the spiritual environment surrounding early Judaism and Christianity. Ideas once treated as strange later additions suddenly appeared rooted within broader ancient traditions. The historical landscape became far more complex. You walk beside museum displays where visitors stare quietly at faded fragments surviving against overwhelming odds. Some feel spiritual wonder, others feel intellectual fascination. Many simply marvel that delicate manuscripts endured through centuries of war, weather neglect, and political upheaval. Survival itself becomes miraculous. One curious detail preserved through archaeological reports notes how dry desert caves protected organic materials extraordinarily well, compared with more humid regions where countless manuscripts disappeared entirely. Geography decides memory surprisingly often. Researchers from Oxford and Harvard continue emphasizing that the rediscovery of Enoch fragments did not end scholarly debates. Instead, it intensified them. Questions multiplied regarding authorship, influence, symbolism, historical context, and theological significance. Ancient mysteries rarely become simpler after rediscovery. Usually the opposite happens. You hear distant desert wind again moving softly beyond hidden cave entrances, where silence guarded these stories for centuries. The Book of Enoch, once nearly lost to many traditions, now re-enters global conversation through archaeology scholarship and renewed public fascination. The buried voices speak again, and modern humanity surrounded by technology, yet still haunted by questions about corruption and power, listens with unexpected attention beneath the same endless stars watching over both ancient scribes and modern seekers alike. The ancient fragments now rest beneath protective glass and careful lighting, yet the debates surrounding them grow louder than ever. Modern scholars gather across universities, conferences, and research libraries, attempting to reconstruct the tangled history behind the Book of Enoch. The puzzle refuses simple assembly. You enter quiet academic rooms filled with dictionaries, photographs, manuscript copies, and exhausted researchers comparing tiny textual differences late into the night. Ancient parchments discovered in desert caves contain gaps, damaged sections, and overlapping traditions copied across centuries. Every fragment matters inimically. In your ears, pages rustle softly while computer screens glow beside faded manuscript photographs enlarged for analysis. Historians trace handwriting styles. Linguists compare sentence structures. Archaeologists examine ink composition and parchment age. Modern scholarship becomes surprisingly physical sometimes. Researchers from Cambridge and Princeton have noted that reconstructing Enoch requires combining evidence from multiple surviving traditions preserved in different languages and communities across history. No single, perfect manuscript exists. Instead, scholars rebuild the text piece by piece like shattered pottery, carefully, patiently, imperfectly. For a moment, it feels as though you stand beside ancient and modern worlds simultaneously. A scribe copying words beside an oil lamp 2,000 years ago suddenly connects with a researcher adjusting digital scans beneath fluorescent light. Different centuries, same human obsession, understanding the past. One curious footnote from manuscript scholarship reveals that certain missing sections of Enoch survived more completely through Ethiopian traditions than through fragments found elsewhere. Entire portions of the book endured because distant communities preserved them faithfully across generations. History survives through unexpected pathways constantly. You continue beside specialists debating authorship and dating. Was Enoch written by one author or several? Which sections emerged first? How much reflects older oral traditions carried through centuries before reaching written form? No universal agreement exists, and honestly, scholars seem to enjoy arguing almost professionally. Researchers from Yale and Oxford continue emphasizing that Enoch likely developed gradually across different historical periods rather than appearing fully formed at once. The text resembles a living tradition accumulating layers over time. That complexity fascinates historians deeply. The Book of Enoch becomes less like a single book and more like a conversation unfolding across generations. In your imagination, rain taps softly against university windows while stacks of research papers spread across crowded desks beside cups of rapidly cooling coffee. Scholars compare ancient flood traditions, angel narratives, astronomical passages, and apocalyptic visions, searching for connections. The work requires enormous patience. Sometimes entire careers focus upon a few damaged lines. You hear low voices discussing parallels between Enoch and neighboring ancient cultures. Researchers from Harvard and Stanford have explored connections between Enochic imagery and older Mesopotamian traditions involving divine councils, cosmic rebellion, and catastrophic floods. Yet Enoch transforms those inherited themes sharply. Its moral intensity stands apart. Power becomes corruption. Forbidden knowledge becomes danger. Heavenly rebellion becomes tragedy rather than heroism. One scandalous aside appearing in modern academic circles even suggests some scholars became frustrated when popular media simplified Enoch into sensational stories about aliens, secret conspiracies, or hidden supernatural technology. Ancient literature suffers strange modern careers sometimes. Researchers from Columbia and the University of Chicago continue debating how literally ancient audiences interpreted the Watchers and Giants. Some scholars view them primarily as symbolic reflections of corrupt rulers and social collapse. Others argue ancient readers likely accepted supernatural elements far more directly than modern audiences often assume. The text resists reduction either way. That resistance keeps scholarship alive. You walk beside conference halls where historians present competing interpretations while audiences scribble notes and prepare difficult questions. Arguments remain passionate because Enoch touches enormous subjects: human corruption, divine justice. The limits of knowledge, the relationship between heaven and earth. Ancient fears still feel uncomfortably modern. In your ears, distant thunder rolls outside a university library, while researchers examine astronomical sections within Enoch describing celestial movements and cosmic order. Some passages reveal surprisingly sophisticated observational knowledge for their time. Others remain deeply symbolic and mysterious. Researchers from Cambridge have argued that these sections demonstrate ancient fascination with understanding structure within creation itself. The heavens represented order, rhythm, and meaning against chaotic earthly existence. People still search the sky for answers now, only the instruments changed. For a moment, it feels as though modern scholars resemble the ancient scribes they study more than they realize. Both groups preserve fragile knowledge against time. Both wrestle with incomplete understanding. Both hope careful interpretation can reveal hidden truths about humanity and history. The continuity feels strangely comforting. One curious detail from modern research history notes how dramatically solid opinion about Enoch shifted after the Dead Sea Scroll discoveries. Texts once considered marginal suddenly became central for understanding ancient religious development. A buried cave reshaped entire academic fields. History turns unexpectedly sometimes. You continue beside museum visitors, staring thoughtfully at reconstructed manuscripts, while guided tours explain Watcher's giants, heavenly journeys, and flood visions beneath soft lighting. Some visitors approach the material spiritually, others intellectually. Many simply feel awe that ancient voices survived at all. The human hunger for meaning crosses centuries effortlessly. Researchers from Oxford and Harvard have emphasized that Enoch's enduring fascination lies partly in its refusal to offer comfortable certainty. The book presents a morally charged universe filled with mystery, judgment, beauty, corruption, and unresolved tension. That complexity feels honest somehow. You hear the final, quiet sounds of turning pages fading into evening silence across modern research libraries where ancient questions remain stubbornly alive. The Book of Enoch continues challenging historians, believers, skeptics, and curious readers alike. And outside those quiet academic rooms, the wider modern world has already begun transforming the Watchers and Giants into something even stranger. Popular imagination is about to take hold. The ancient Watchers step quietly out of dusty manuscripts now and into modern imagination. Their shadows stretch across novels, films, conspiracy theories, online forums, documentaries, and whispered late-night conversations between curious strangers staring into glowing screens. The old stories evolve again. You move through the modern world where fragments of Enoch suddenly appear everywhere once you begin noticing them. Fallen angels haunt popular fiction. Giant beings stride through fantasy worlds. Forbidden knowledge drives countless stories about power, corruption, and humanity reaching beyond safe limits. Ancient fears adapt beautifully to modern anxieties. In your ears, television static blends with distant city traffic, while rain streaks against apartment windows, glowing late into the night. Somewhere someone scrolls through theories about ancient civilizations and heavenly beings. Somewhere else, a novelist shapes old Enochic imagery into fresh myth for modern readers. The Watchers never fully disappeared. They changed costume. Researchers from Stanford and Columbia have noted that modern fascination with apocalyptic and supernatural traditions often intensifies during periods of technological acceleration, political instability, and cultural uncertainty. Ancient narratives about corruption and cosmic disorder suddenly feel emotionally relevant again. Human beings remain wonderfully predictable that way. For a moment, it feels as though the ancient desert stars now shine above crowded modern cities filled with neon signs, satellites, and sleepless apartment towers. Technology changes civilization dramatically, yet certain questions refuse extinction. Can knowledge become dangerous? Does power inevitably corrupt? Are unseen forces shaping human history? The Book of Enoch still whispers into those questions. One curious footnote from contemporary cultural studies reveals that some readers approach Enoch spiritually while others treat it almost like hidden historical evidence, explaining mysteries mainstream society supposedly ignores. People love secret explanations, especially complicated ones. You continue through the bookstores lined with fantasy epics, supernatural thrillers, and speculative histories borrowing heavily from Enochic themes. Fallen angels become tragic anti-heroes. Giants transform into ancient warriors. Hidden heavenly knowledge powers modern conspiracy narratives. The original warnings sometimes fade beneath entertainment, yet traces remain recognizable. Researchers from Yale and Oxford have argued that Enoch persists culturally because it blends cosmic scale with deeply human concerns. The story addresses ambition, pride, rebellion, injustice, and forbidden curiosity through unforgettable imagery. And imagery survives longer than doctrine often does. You drift beside late-night podcast recordings where hosts discuss ancient texts beneath soft studio lights while listeners across the world settle into darkness with headphones and restless curiosity. Some conversations remain thoughtful and scholarly. Others wander far into speculation. The internet unsurprisingly amplifies both wisdom and chaos simultaneously. Ancient scribes probably would have found modern comment sections spiritually exhausting. In your imagination, glowing computer screens reflect across tired faces, while online communities debate whether the Watchers were symbolic beings, literal angels, misunderstood rulers, or even visitors from distant worlds. The Book of Enoch becomes cultural clay shaped endlessly by modern imagination. No agreement emerges, none likely ever will. Researchers from Harvard and Princeton continue emphasizing the importance of distinguishing historical scholarship from sensational reinterpretation. Yet they also acknowledge something important. Ancient texts survive partly because new generations keep reimagining them. Stories live through adaptation, even strange adaptation. One scandalous aside appearing in media analysis suggests modern entertainment sometimes strips Enochic themes of moral seriousness, entirely transforming warnings about corruption into glamorous celebrations of power and rebellion instead. Humanity still struggles separating fascination from wisdom. That problem sounds familiar somehow. You continue through crowded conventions, streaming platforms, bookstores, and online spaces where the Watchers appear repeatedly beneath different names and symbols. Some creators portray them sympathetically. Others return closer to Enoch's darker vision of pride and catastrophic boundary breaking. The ancient tensions remain alive beneath modern packaging. Researchers from Cambridge and the University of Chicago have observed that apocalyptic imagery gains renewed popularity whenever societies feel unstable or overwhelmed by rapid change. Climate fears, technological disruption, political polarization, and existential uncertainty all create fertile ground for ancient cosmic narratives. People search old stories for orientation during confusing eras. The pattern repeats constantly throughout history. In your ears, distant thunder echoes beyond modern skylines, while documentaries discuss hidden manuscripts and ancient mysteries beneath dramatic music. The Watchers become part of contemporary mythology now woven into entertainment spirituality, skepticism, and conspiracy culture simultaneously. The boundaries blur. Boom. For a moment, it feels as though Enoch itself watches modern humanity with quiet recognition. The ancient warnings about knowledge detached from wisdom suddenly sound unsettlingly relevant within an age of artificial intelligence. Surveillance systems, engineered technologies, and endless information flowing faster than human judgment comfortably handles. The old questions return wearing modern clothes. What happens when power outpaces moral maturity? Can civilization survive its own ambitions? Researchers from Columbia and Stanford have pointed toward this continuing relevance as one reason Enoch remains culturally magnetic despite its age and disputed status. The text speaks directly into recurring human anxieties about corruption, spreading through systems larger than individual control. Ancient fears, contemporary forms. You hear soft music drifting from another apartment window while someone turns pages late into the night reading about heavenly rebellion beneath electric light instead of oil lamps. Thousands of years separate modern readers from ancient scribes, yet curiosity bridges the distance effortlessly. The stars above remain mostly unchanged too. One curious detail from cultural studies notes how many modern readers describe encountering Enoch as strangely unsettling compared with other ancient texts. Its visions feel raw, cosmic, and emotionally unresolved. Perhaps that honesty explains the discomfort. The Book of Enoch never promises humanity easy innocence. You settle now beneath the quiet modern night while city lights glow beneath distant constellations once studied by ancient watchers and wandering shepherds alike. The giants have faded into legend. The flood survives through memory. The hidden manuscripts emerged once more from desert silence. Yet the deepest questions remain unfinished. And somewhere beyond all modern noise and endless debate, the ancient story still waits beneath the stars, asking humanity whether wisdom can finally outrun pride before another kind of flood arrives. The night grows quieter now. Modern cities dim gradually beneath clouds and scattered stars, while countless people drift towards sleep, carrying worries, ambitions, memories, and questions older than civilization itself. The story of Enoch lingers softly in the darkness behind those thoughts. Ancient voices rarely leave completely once heard. You sit beside the long river of history stretching backward through drowned worlds, hidden caves, desert caravans, lonely scribes, frightened survivors, and restless scholars chasing fragile fragments across centuries. The Watchers descended long ago beneath ancient stars, yet their shadow still moves quietly through human imagination. Because the story was never only about angels, it was always about humanity too. In your ears, soft wind brushes through distant trees, while rain taps gently against windows somewhere far away. The world tonight feels calmer than the violent age Enoch described, yet not entirely different. People still chase power beyond wisdom. Nations still struggle beneath pride and fear. Technology still races faster than moral certainty comfortably follows. The old warnings remain strangely current. Researchers from Oxford and Harvard have observed that enduring myths survive, not because every detail remains historically provable, but because the emotional truths inside them continue speaking across generations. Enoch endures because it asks questions humanity never fully resolves. What limits should exist? Who guards knowledge responsibly? Can corruption spread invisibly through entire societies? The ancient text refuses easy comfort. For a moment it feels as though you stand once more beneath the endless desert sky that watched over shepherds, scribes, kings, and wandering exiles long before modern civilization existed. The stars remain enormous above the sleeping earth. Ancient people feared them, studied them, prayed beneath them, and searched them for meaning. You still do in quieter ways. One curious footnote from modern astronomy history notes that even today many people experience profound emotional reactions simply from seeing truly dark night skies untouched by city lights. Perhaps ancient humanity's fascination with heaven was never irrational at all. The universe naturally humbles human beings. You continue reflecting beside the long, strange path travelled by the Book of Enoch itself. A text nearly lost, a warning nearly forgotten, preserved through fragile manuscripts, isolated communities, buried caves, and stubborn curiosity across thousands of years. That survival feels almost miraculous. Researchers from Yale and Cambridge continued debating Enoch's exact origins, influence, and meaning, yet perhaps part of the book's enduring power comes from its refusal to settle neatly into certainty. The visions remain mysterious. The symbolism remains layered. The questions remain open. Mystery keeps stories alive. Complete certainty usually ends conversation. In your imagination, candle flames flicker softly across ancient parchment while modern computer screens glow in distant apartments where curious readers still search these old pages for understanding. Time separates the worlds physically, yet emotionally, the distance shrinks. Human beings remain beautifully recognizable across centuries. You still fear collapse. You still hunger for wisdom. You still wonder whether unseen moral structure exists beneath chaotic history. The Book of Enoch speaks directly into those instincts. One scandalous aside lingering through centuries of interpretation claims the greatest danger was never merely the Watchers themselves, but humanity's willingness to accept power without asking whether it deserved trust. That possibility feels uncomfortable, especially now. Researchers from Stanford and Columbia have pointed toward Enoch's unusual emphasis on responsibility connected to knowledge. The problem is not curiosity alone. Curiosity built civilizations, medicines, music, mathematics, and art. The danger emerges when knowledge separates from humility and moral restraint. Ancient storytellers understood that tension deeply. Modern civilization still wrestles with it daily. In your ears, the distant sound of thunder fades gently beyond the horizon, while warm lamplight settles across quiet rooms where families sleep peacefully tonight. The world continues carrying both beauty and danger together. It always has. The flood came and passed. The giants vanished into memory. The imprisoned watchers faded into legend. Yet human choices still shape the earth constantly. For a moment, it feels as though the entire story softens into reflection rather than warning alone. Enoch witnessed corruption, judgment, and catastrophe, but he also witnessed order beyond chaos. The heavens in his visions remained structured even when the world below descended into violence. That hope matters. Justice delayed was not justice abandoned. Researchers from Princeton and the University of Chicago have noted that ancient apocalyptic literature often balanced fear with reassurance. However dark the present became, corruption would not reign forever. History possessed direction beyond immediate suffering. People desperately needed that belief during unstable ages. Perhaps they still do. You settle deeper now into the quiet rhythm of the night while stars move slowly beyond sight above roofs. Forests, oceans, deserts, and sleeping cities. Somewhere ancient caves still hold silence beneath stone. Somewhere scholars continue arguing gently over faded manuscripts. Somewhere another curious reader opens the Book of Enoch for the first time beneath dim light and growing fascination. The story continues travelling, as all powerful stories do. And maybe that is the final lesson resting quietly beneath all the visions of watchers, giants, prisons, floods, and heavenly fire. Human beings inherit knowledge constantly, but wisdom requires slower work. Power arrives quickly, understanding rarely does. The ancient world learned that painfully. The modern world still learns it now. Sleep comes softly at last beside these old memories carried across thousands of years beneath the same endless sky, watching patiently over every generation that rises, struggles, wonders, and disappears again into history. So as tonight's journey closes, I would truly love to hear what stayed with you most. Maybe it was the lonely figure of Enoch walking through impossible visions, or the haunting image of the watchers staring down from heaven beneath ancient stars. Maybe the floodwaters felt strangely symbolic, or perhaps the warnings about pride and forbidden knowledge sounded uncomfortably modern. Leave a comment sharing the moment that lingered in your imagination the longest, along with your location and local time. It is always wonderful seeing listeners from every corner of the world gathering together beneath these stories. And if this journey through the Book of Enoch helped you relax, reflect, or simply drift peacefully into the night, there are many more ancient histories and forgotten worlds waiting for you on this channel. You can continue into stories of lost empires, buried myths, mysterious rulers, wandering prophets, and civilizations swallowed by time till each one carries its own quiet atmosphere. Strange beauty and timeless questions about what it means to be human. Thank you for spending this evening here with me beneath the ancient stars. Your time, curiosity, and presence genuinely mean a great deal. Until the next journey, may your night be calm, your dreams peaceful, and your heart a little lighter as sleep slowly carries you away through the endless river of history. Blessings to you and your family.